Hello, I am Susanna Massardis, CEO for the Community Liver Alliance. We are delighted to bring to you the third annual NASH update. I'd like to thank our speakers and planning committee and sponsors, UPMC, AbbVie, and Exact Sciences. It is now my pleasure to introduce to you our Fatty Liver Coalition co-chair, Dr. Maya Balakrishnan. Dr. Balakrishnan is an assistant professor of medicine at Baylor College of Medicine. She is a practicing gastroenterologist, clinical investigator, and director of the NAFLD program at Ben Taub Hospital. She is the Fatty Liver Coalition co-chair and moderator for tonight's program. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Balakrishnan.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Susanna. Good evening and welcome to the third annual NASH update. As mentioned, I'm Dr. Maya Balakrishnan. I'm an assistant professor of medicine and a gastroenterologist at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, Texas. I'm the co-chair for the Fatty Liver Coalition and a moderator for tonight's program, along with my coalition co-chair, Dr. Karen Jerome Sapatka. Dr. Sapatka is a physician partner with Valley Gastroenterology Associates, and Four Seasons Endoscopy Center, and a medical director for the VGA Center for Obesity Medicine. Tonight's program was developed in conjunction with the Community Liver Alliance Fatty Liver Coalition. The Fatty Liver Coalition is a national collective dedicated to improving the continuum of fatty liver prevention, diagnosis, care, education, and support services. So on behalf of myself, Dr. Jerome Zapatka, and the Fatty Liver Coalition members, we're very excited to have you with us. We thank you for joining us to learn about fatty liver and associated metabolic diseases. We have a fantastic lineup of experts in the field to provide up-to-date information on fatty liver, NASH, transplant, pediatric fatty liver disease, and nutrition. We also have an update on drug developments, and you'll also hear from a patient and caregiver. Each talk is about 20 minutes long with a Q&A session. You can feel free to put your questions in the chat box and I'll address them to be answered at the end of each session. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker and my coalition co-chair, Dr. Karen Jerome Sapatka. She's going to present on nutrition for fatty liver and metabolic health, an incredibly important topic. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Sapatka.
Thank you, Maya. And thank you everyone for attending tonight. I'm delighted to be here. I will be speaking about nutrition, but before we really get into that, I would like to just really begin to review metabolic health and what that means. And you'll see that it's so important when it comes to the fatty liver sphere. Next slide. So the first question we'll ask is, what is good metabolic health? And I think you've probably all heard about the metabolic syndrome. It was first really coined by an endocrinologist, Gerald Raven from Stanford, when he began to see a clustering of these findings and associating it with something called insulin resistance, and seeing that these patients that had these clustering of findings had higher risks for a number of what we now think of as metabolic diseases. And so if you look at really what it to meet the criterion of metabolic syndrome, we're looking at abdominal obesity, an elevated fasting blood sugar, hypertension, low HDL, and high triglyceride. And the technical definition is if you have 3 or more of these, you can be termed metabolic syndrome. He used to call it Syndrome X. It was also known as the insulin resistance syndrome. But I would like to make the case that if we see even one, that should really raise a red flag that this is someone who's moving on to poor metabolic health. Next slide. And this is a look at the latest national survey, something called the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. This was from 2009 to 2016. And they do these surveys every 5 years or so. And then when they really dug into this survey, it was pretty sobering to see that of the United States population, looking at thousands of people, only about 12% of our population is what we would term metabolically healthy. 88% of the population had at least one criterion for poor metabolic health. And the other interesting thing about this was that less than 1/3 of normal weight people met the criterion for good metabolic health. Next slide. And so I think it's clear that obesity is not the problem. Obesity is a marker of the problem, but it is not the problem. Metabolic syndrome is the problem. It's where the vast majority of our healthcare dollars go. And as we talked about, when you have metabolic syndrome, you are at risk for a variety of diseases, including diabetes, hypertension, lipid abnormalities, heart disease, fatty liver, polycystic ovarian disease, cancers, and dementia. Next slide. And so when we think about it in its simplest terms, what is metabolism? I like to think about it that it is the way that we convert the food that we eat into energy for our cells and organs to function. And insulin, which is secreted by our pancreas when we eat, plays a key role. So I think the old way of thinking of eat less and move more to lose weight is now being replaced by the new thinking, which is eat in a manner that enhances how our body responds to the food that we eat, something that we think of as nutritional biochemistry. Next slide. And so if we think about insulin resistance, which is the phenomenon that's at the core of metabolic syndrome, you can think about it very simply. If you look at the cell on the left, that's a cell of an organ, and you're looking at you've eaten and you want to get that energy in the form of glucose into your cell, into the mitochondria, which is basically the engine of your cell. Insulin opens up the door to that cell so the energy can get into the cell, go to the engine of the cell, which is the mitochondria, and you have normal cell function. The cell on the right is an insulin resistant cell. Insulin cannot open up that door. Energy cannot get into the cell and get to the engine of the cell, and energy production is impaired. That would be considered, in a very simplistic way, insulin resistance. Next slide. And so the problem is that insulin puts energy into all the cells of the body. You think about the brain, the heart, the muscle, the liver, the fat tissue, the bones, nerves. We need insulin to put energy into all of these cells. And when the cells are insulin resistant, we can't get our energy into these cells. And so it's no wonder that patients become ill. Next slide. And when we think about insulin resistance, there are multiple factors that can influence insulin resistance, from what we call dysbiosis, or an altered bacteria in the gut, smoking, poor sleep, lack of sunlight, chronic stress, age, even genetics obviously play a role. But what we're going to concentrate on this evening is nutrition, which would be refined foods, and we'll talk about that, and physical activity, which Chris Koski will get into in the next talk. Next slide. And so we think about this insulin resistance. It's a spectrum from having a normal insulin level, being healthy, no metabolic problems, to the far end of the spectrum where you have full-fledged diabetes and other metabolic problems, fatty liver, high insulin levels, and being very unhealthy. And I think the moral of the story is, again, if you think you're thin and you're safe, we have to think again, because many thin people can have very significant metabolic derangements. Next slide. And so when we think about nutrition, we really have to go back to, when did this all start? And I think we really have to start with the guidelines that started in the 70s and certainly by 1980, saying that we should follow a low-fat diet. And this all started with a researcher on the cover of Time magazine there, Ansel Keys, who had a hypothesis that fat raised cholesterol, and that's what caused heart disease. And so he put out this hypothesis that we should all be reducing our fat. And back in the 50s, probably close to 40% of our diet was saturated animal fat. And so with his hypothesis, he proposed that we should dramatically cut our total fat intake and our saturated fat intake. And there were other people really trying to say that it was probably more sugar and carbohydrates, but he did a fantastic job of becoming a lead figure within the American Heart Association. And so these guidelines really got put out there in a formal way in the late 70s, early 80s. There was also a big push from the sugar industry, and documents have shown that they paid off scientists at Harvard to really publish a few papers in the New England Journal of Medicine that really pointed the blame to fat rather than to sugar. Next slide. there were many voices across the country that raised the alarm at that time that, what are we doing? How can the federal government propose a vast national experiment by lowering fat to this degree when there was really no concrete evidence at the time? And even George Mann, the gentleman on the right, who was one of the associate directors of the Framingham Heart Study, raised concerns and thought that this entire generation of citizens had been misled by what he called the greatest scientific deception of our times, the notion that animal fat caused heart disease. Next slide. And in fact, when an article was published recently in the British Medical Journal, where they did a systematic review and meta-analysis of all of the studies ever done on low-fat diets and found that there was no evidence to support a low-fat diet. In fact, in some of the subgroups, they found, particularly postmenopausal women with heart disease, they fared poorer on a low-fat diet. And so finally, in June of 2020, for the first time in a cardiology journal, the Journal of the American College of Cardiology, they published an article that very clearly stated a whole fat dairy, unprocessed meat, eggs, and dark chocolate are saturated fatty acid rich foods within a complex matrix that are not associated with an increased risk of heart disease, and that the totality of the available evidence does not support any further limiting on the intake of these types of fats, saturated fats. Next slide. And so you'll hear this term dietary matrix, and a lot of this comes from the work of Dr. Jeff Volek from Ohio State University, where he pretty convincingly shows that what happens to saturated fats when you eat them is totally dependent upon how much carbohydrate you're taking. And if you're taking a saturated fat with a high carbohydrate diet, yes, that will lead to increasing plasma saturated fat, insulin resistance, and dyslipidemia. But if you take that saturated fat in the context of a lower carbohydrate diet, there is no issue with that. Next slide. And so the question remains then, why were these low-fat guidelines ever put into place? But we can see back late 70s, 1980 is when these guidelines came into play. And since then, we've just seen ever increasing incidence of not just obesity, but diabetes and fatty liver. If you think back to, say, 1979, 1980, non-alcoholic fatty liver or metabolic associated fatty liver disease had not even been described before that year, and is now, the #1 cause of liver transplantation in people under the age of 50. Next slide. And so with this declaration of a low-fat diet based upon no true scientific evidence, the food industry responded by replacing saturated fat with sugar, removing the fiber to extend the shelf life of products. And now we have so many processed food items on the market, and nearly 80% of them are laced with added sugar. And we also have to understand that, I'll speak about it in a little bit, that the fat in processed food is not animal saturated fat. It is primarily what we call omega-6 linoleic acid, a pro-inflammatory seed, vegetable, or canola oil, a very, very different type of fat now in our processed foods. And so this perfect storm has really dramatically altered our body's biochemistry. Next slide. When you think about the first food pyramid, you can see at the bottom, the recommendation was 6 to 11 servings of grains, breads, pastas a day. And fast forward to today's diet, where it's now, the predictions are that around 60 to maybe 70% of our diet is processed foods. And those consist primarily of 3 ingredients: refined wheat flour, sugar, and the processed omega-6 linoleic acid vegetable oils. Next slide. And so we're just going to examine what each of these 3 food groups in processed foods do to us. So if we look at starches and sugar and we see what they do to insulin response, we can see that these starches and sugars, which are carbohydrates, raise our blood sugar and then our insulin level higher than any other food group. Protein a little bit, and fats barely do not raise blood sugar or insulin at all. Next slide. And so when we raise this insulin level by overeating starches, carbohydrates, sugars, the insulin level is considered the fat storage hormone. The action of insulin is to promote putting that energy into fat cells as storage and then physiologically locking that fat into the fat cell. So the old thought that we used to have that we would eat that donut and then go walk it off is really just physiologically impossible, since if you have a high insulin level on board from that food, it's physiologically impossible to burn that fat. And then as you have higher and higher insulin levels by eating more and more starches and sugars, your fat cells begin to grow and grow and grow. And eventually the fat cells get to a point where they've outgrown their blood supply and they become hypoxic because they don't have enough oxygen. They become extremely inflamed and insulin resistant themselves. And then the fat cells break open and let all of those free fatty acids within the fat cells stream through the body and take up residence in multiple different organs, including intra-abdominally, into the pancreas, into the liver, into the muscle, again, promoting insulin resistance systemically. Next slide. So then we'll move on to fructose or sugar. Fructose is the component of sugar that is uniquely toxic to the liver, and it's its own driver of insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome. Only the liver can metabolize fructose in a meaningful way. And when you eat a lot of sugar, particularly sugar-sweetened beverages that create a massive tidal wave of fructose going into the liver, this excess fructose can cause liver cell dysfunction at the mitochondrial level. And by a particular pathway, it can inactivate the hepatic insulin receptor and lead to insulin resistance within the liver. Once the liver is insulin resistant, it begins to pour out blood sugar into the blood, promoting diabetes, and also promotes what's called de novo lipogenesis, where you begin to build fat in the liver, promoting fatty liver. And the liver tries to export this extra fat as triglyceride, part of what's called atherogenic dyslipidemia, which becomes a risk factor for heart disease. Next slide. And so this is just a schematic that looks at whether you're insulin sensitive or insulin resistant. So when you eat that carbohydrate, such as in sugar or starch, they have them eating a piece of bread that turns into blood sugar. If you're insulin sensitive, your muscles and liver can take that up and store it and use it, and you'll be fine. But if you're insulin resistant, your glucose can't be taken up by your muscles. And so it's shunted into the liver, where again, it's turned into fat by that process called de novo lipogenesis, which promotes fatty liver and elevated triglycerides. Next slide. And the last part of our processed food triad I'd like to talk about are the vegetable oils, which have been considered to be heart healthy, but we now know may not be the case. And part of the issue is that all of these high polyunsaturated fatty acid oils contain omega-6 linoleic acid as one of the polyunsaturated fatty acids. Next slide. And if you think about the two essential fatty acids, we think about omega-6, omega-3. They are both essential fatty acids that we need to get in our diet, but we only need them in small amounts as signaling molecules. They are not meant to be a fuel source. If we think about the good omega-3 sources, wild fish, pastured or grass-fed animals, green vegetables, different types of seeds, versus the omega-6 fatty acids, which are seen in vegetable and seed oils, shortening, margarine, and grain-fed animals. These two have antagonistic or competing metabolic functions. Omega-3 inhibits inflammation, platelet aggregation, which leads to clotting and enhances vasodilation or dilation of your blood vessels, as opposed to omega-6s, which enhance inflammation, platelet aggregation, and vasostriction, which can promote clotting and obviously inflammation. So back in the old days, they predicted that our omega-3 to omega-6 ratio was maybe 1:1 or at most 4:1. Now with our present day diet, we get 20 to 50 times more omega-6 than omega-3 fatty acids in our diet. And there is a lot of school of thought that this dramatic shift in our fat source has contributed to the emergence of these chronic diseases. Next slide. And this is just on the left-hand side is just showing that 100 years ago, nearly all of the fat that we got in our diet was from animal fat. And fast forward a century, we're getting a huge amount of our daily calories in the form of linoleic acid, omega-6 fatty acids from these seed oils. And on the right was actually an interesting study by Stefan Gayane, where they actually did biopsies of human fat tissue and found that from 1960 to 2010, the amount of this omega-6 linoleic acid in our fat tissues had just skyrocketed. Next slide. And this is just a schematic. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but it's just laying out several mechanisms that are postulated about the harm that omega-6 fatty acids can cause. But I think if you look at the center of the slide where it says mitochondrial dysfunction, I think that's, going to be one of the central themes with these fats, and that this mitochondrial dysfunction can promote insulin resistance and then be a promoter of the metabolic syndrome. Next slide. And so if we think about the nutrition, what we want to, the take home message and what we're doing in our practice with all of this, this is what we call our cornerstones of care. This is our template for what we're using in our own practice, both with my obesity medicine patients, as well as our fatty liver patients. This template here is particular to our fatty liver patients. But if you look at the nutritional part of the slide, we're transitioning all of our patients, we're weaning them off of all processed foods and transitioning them to real foods. And in doing that, we know that we're going to reduce their sugar intake and we're going to reduce their linoleic acid, their omega-6 fatty acid intake. And then we're applying a principle called therapeutic carbohydrate reduction, where we're beginning to lower their carbohydrates in a meaningful way, particularly the starches and the sugars. And then obviously we're assuring that they're getting adequate protein. And so that's one of the cornerstones of our program. The others are, the medical evaluation of the fatty liver patient, which will be talked about in great detail in subsequent lectures, the physical activity aspect of things that we know impacts insulin resistance and insulin sensitivity. And Chris Koski, our next speaker, will be talking about our collaboration with their resistance band workshop that they've worked out for our obesity and fatty liver patients. And then our behavioral aspect of things, where part of that is actually screening for processed food addiction and getting patients help if we think that they may have an addiction to sugar or processed foods. Next slide. And so we speak with the patient about the root cause solutions to this root cause issue of insulin resistance. And so we talk to them about, lowering their fructose, incorporating healthy fats, making sure they're getting the right types of proteins, and getting a lot of non-starchy vegetables. Next slide. And so the bottom line is we encourage our patients to become part of the JERF Club, just eat real food. And I think that it is the simplest message that we can give patients, is to begin to transition off of processed foods and eat foods that are real, that do not have a label. And I would encourage you all to look at every label, because I think you'll be shocked at the amount of added sugar and these processed seed oils that are going to be in just about everything that's packaged. So thank you.
That was great. Thanks so much, Dr. Sapatka. I'm just checking to see if there's any questions in the chat box. Not yet, but maybe a little bit later. So now changing, well, there's one that just popped up in the Q&A. So now changing gears to physical activity. So one of the four important cornerstones of fatty liver care, as just pointed out. Chris Koski is going to be talking to us about physical activity for the fatty liver patient. She's an exercise specialist and owner of the Be Well Nation Fitness Center. Chris has a group fitness certifications through the American Council on Exercise and the National Associate of Fitness certifications, along with licensing as a youth exercise specialist. So we are excited to hear about recommendations regarding physical activity for the patient with fatty liver disease.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And thank you to all of the patients and the clients in the audience tonight, taking this big first step, learning more about your diagnosis or maybe the diagnosis of a loved one. So thank you so much for joining us. Let's start with that big doctor's appointment, the appointment where you get the diagnosis. You have a fatty liver. You may have multiple chronic conditions. And so it's been recommended to you that you begin resistance training. Well, what does that mean? Is that the barbell in your basement? Is that hand weights? Is it a loop, a band, a tube? Can I use my own body? That's a form of resistance. When we start throwing all those options out there, things become very overwhelming. And for a lot of us, we're going to check out on that. So that's one of the things we want to talk about tonight. Next slide, please. So my objectives today, among that one, we're also going to bring to light the common barriers toward exercise. And you need to know there is no shame in relating to these barriers, because part of this challenge is not your responsibility as a patient or client. It's ours as exercise providers to help you get through that challenge. So we'll talk about the recommendations for resistance training, what works, how much, how often, and we'll also dig into the resistance training program, part of that cornerstone of care that Dr. Zapaka just mentioned. We've been doing a program with Dr. Zapaka since late 2017, so we'll talk about that as well. We'll take a look at the evidence which backs resistance training as part of the treatment protocol for many chronic illnesses and conditions. And we'll also give you a little insight into the approach that we take with people who may be returning to exercise for the first time in a very long time, or maybe exercising regularly for the first time in their adult lives. We have to find the purpose and the reason for them to create this habit. And then our last point tonight, I'll talk about some desired outcomes. And I will tell you right now, they are not what you may be thinking in this moment. Next slide, please. So we know from exercise behavior studies that to create this habit of consistency, there has to be an alignment of values and a pattern of behavior. We learned this from a study that happened in 2014 with Middle Tennessee State University, and they studied fitness psychology and this connecting the values and the behavior pattern. So we have to link this pattern with happiness and joy and having pleasant feelings. No one wants to do something if they don't enjoy it. We may have to, but we have to find that link and associate those pleasant experiences with movement to create that pattern of consistency. When someone is at a crossroads in their health, that alignment is off. There's a bit of a disconnect. So a patient or a client might say something like this: I value my good health. I want to be healthy, but I'm overweight and I do not have an active lifestyle. So when we hear something like that, or there's that misalignment in values, we have to call out the barriers first. And the big one is time. Insufficient time to exercise. What does that really mean? That means, as according to the Mayo Clinic, who put together, they identified all of these barriers. When someone says, I don't have the time, what they might really be saying is, I have something in that place right now, and I don't want to move it. I have something that I enjoy there, and I don't want it to go away. So now we just say, there is no time. The ripple effect of change is bigger than we realize. It's very easy for me as an exercise provider to say, you just need to exercise 30 minutes a day and you need to do it 2-3 times a week. But now that 30 minutes sounds simple, but what used to happen in that 30 minutes? And where does that activity go? And what other parts of the day are now affected because that 30 minutes has been inserted? And what people in my life are being affected? And compound that with the 30 minutes happening 3 times a week. All of a sudden we become overwhelmed again. So as exercise providers, we have to help. We must prepare our clients for change. That second barrier, you can see the inconvenience of exercise. Do I have to drive to a gym? Where am I going to do this? Do I have to create a space at home? I don't want to go to a new environment. That's the inconvenience of exercise. A lack of self-motivation is really about community and connection with other people who are going through the same experience. Change is always easier with other people on board, especially when starting an exercise routine. Community is key. Non-enjoyment of exercise. This is the person who's had the bad experience at the gym. This is the person who's had the body shaming experience with a trainer. This is someone who still remembers the horrible gym classes in high school, and they haven't exercised since. So again, we need to create experiences that are pleasant, that you have a perceived control of, and that we create those memories so we're more consistent. Because we want to create those bank of memories for someone who may not have any memories associated with the joy of movement. And so they might be the people who say, I don't like to exercise. They have a very different bank of memories. So again, this is about change. Probably most important of all the barriers, the one at the bottom, this is the fear of self-efficacy, or this is a low self-efficacy and just fear. And what we're talking about here is the fear of injury, the fear of falling, the fear of embarrassment. We need to remove those barriers as exercise providers. So when we bring forth a program where someone feels they have control, where they can progress at their pace while still staying within the realm of doing something effective, we take away this barrier. So as exercise providers, we are changing the way exercise is presented. We have to follow that researched, prescribed way to move, but we need to approach this in a less clinical style. Next slide, please. So the plan has to be a little less rigid, but structured. We want to focus on progress over perfection and the outdated cliches that you might associate with exercise. No pain, no gain. It's just like brushing your teeth. Make it a habit until you don't think about it. No thought, just action. We need to bridge the gap that I have here on this slide. Bridge that gap between the clinical space of something prescribed, almost like a physical therapy setting, but taking it up in from the other side of that group exercise perceived notion of being judged or what that atmosphere feels like. We want to meet them somewhere in the middle. Next slide, please. So the recommendation and the recommended amount of resistance training is here in the infographic from the American College of Sports Medicine. And it's 2 to 3 sets of 8 to 12 repetitions. And so how heavy do we start? What band do we use? We're going to pick a starting point and a starting amount of resistance based on the recommendations and assessment of a fitness professional. So the total body will include 8 to 10 multi-joint exercises and then working the major muscle groups while we do those 8 to 10 multi-joint exercises. So the workout in its entirety is going to go about 30 to 40 minutes with a small warm-up and a small cool-down, a period of stretching, and they'll do that workout 2 to 3 times a week, which you'll see right there in the infographic. But how do we do it? We need to simplify the equipment all the way down to handled resistance tubing. And so this makes the workout very easy, very accessible. Just a handled resistance tube and body weight is what we're going to use. So you can do this in front of the television, in watching your favorite show. You can do this on vacation. You can take it when you're traveling anywhere, on business. You can do it at work. If you're still in an office, take the band with you. It's in a drawer. So there are no gyms required, making this a very accessible program. Let's look at the evidence-backed benefits for resistance training, also in this infographic right there on the left-hand side. Resistance training improves muscle strength, endurance, and power. What is power? Power is control and self-efficacy over the body's movement. So we take away that fear of falling. We take away the fear of embarrassment. We take away the fear of self-injury once they have that self-efficacy and control through resistance training. Because before we can recommend any vigorous cardio, any type of aerobic activity, we have to make sure that the core stability, the balance, and that self-confidence is there for a client to say, I'm ready to move on and I can do more. Resistance training accomplishes that. There are other benefits too, you can see there on the left. Of course, blood glucose regulation, as Dr. Zapaka mentioned. Bone, muscle, and connective tissue durability and growth improves with consistent resistance training. And there are other benefits as well that you can see there. And as you see, the long list of conditions, which can include resistance training as part of the treatment protocol, and to help manage symptoms within those chronic illnesses. But what about fatty liver? Next slide, please. So this is from 2014 from the World Journal of Gastroenterology. And again, we start with what the report uncovered. the barriers with fatty liver patients. We know that there is a poorer health-related quality of life compared with healthy U.S. population, both on the physical and mental health scores. Fatigue is a common symptom among it. So we also know that although NAFLD patients want that healthy lifestyle, here's that disconnect again, they lack the self-confidence because they are afraid of falling. Next slide, please. So here's the evidence from the same report from the World Journal of Gastroenterology. Number one, with weight management and cardiovascular health, improving balance and reducing the risks of falls, right? Several components of physical function contributes to health-related quality of life and well tolerated even among coronary heart disease or the elderly. So a wide population of people can be helped with resistance training. And the American Heart Association and the ACSM say that if you have physical limitations or you have low motivation, which prevents aerobic training, that patient or that client isn't there yet for cardio, for aerobic activity, start with resistance training as the alternative option, building that self-efficacy, that core stability, and balance. So in our own program, we kind of take that a step further with the option to perform the resistance tube exercises, either standing or seated. Again, making sure that the client understands they have control over their body and they will not self-injure before we progress them. Next slide, please. So this is our approach, and it's part of our Be Well at Home program. We've been working with Dr. Zapaka since 2017, and we start this. We took the American College of Sports Medicine recommendations, and our exercise physiologist Leslie Benedetto designed a series of exercises that we use in the Be Well at Home program. One of the big components is community and ongoing human connection. We start with a live 2-hour interactive in-person or online workshop. And this is where we work on the basics. We work on form, we work on safety. We make sure that when a client leaves that workshop, they have the groundwork for self-efficacy. It's already been set. So in our workshop, when we talk about barriers, we also talk about current lifestyles because again, we want to add this in to a client's life. We don't want them to think that it's an either or. That is a lot of hard change. Let's insert it first instead of thinking about what can be eliminated. So can we fit this in while you're watching television? Can we fit this in while you're listening to music? That's what we talk about. What's your current lifestyle like? Can you work out in the morning or the evening? Where are you your most productive? These are the things that we talk about. We want to maximize enjoyment and minimize the pain of change, giving that perceived choice to our clients so that they feel they are in control and they are setting the tone with this resistance training program. So our goal for our Be Well at Home participants is to shift that mindset from the, I have to exercise, to the, I want to exercise. We follow that up with social support as well. We have everything from social media. They have access to the facilitators of the program, including myself. We have a series of emails that we send out because that connection is important. Next slide, please. So we could break all of these barriers. We could personalize the workout. We could keep the communications line open. But what is really needed, the key ingredient, is for our clients to find a purpose. What is the why, the intrinsic motivation for them to begin this exercise program? And it can't be the number on the scale. It can't be because my doctor told me so, a class reunion, a wedding. Those are short-term goal setting. It's a great marker for motivation, but the American Council on Exercise reports that it takes 6 months of consistent practices before any habit will become part of a lifestyle. And we've got some long-term adherence to an exercise program. So this kind of takes us back to the crossroads in someone's health. Take the road that you're on right now, and your doctors have very well told you what path you will go down if you take that road. But take the other road, and you'll find some true value and purpose that will keep you going. A better quality of life, maybe a reason to improve your health, something that's going to keep you going on the days when you do not want to resistance train. And we are very honest, and we tell clients that they will have those days where they do not want to exercise. And so that's when you have to find that intrinsic motivation that is going to cause you to pick up the band or decide to exercise when you do not want to exercise. Something that I just found this week is April 2021 Harvard study published through the Journal of Behavioral Medicine. They actually found a bidirectional relationship between exercise and a purpose in life. So when you begin physical activity, and in their study it was a course of 4 years, when you begin physical activity, you start to find more purpose and meaning in your life. And once you have more purpose and meaning in your life, you engage in more physical activity. Next slide, please. So one way to uncover that purpose and put together an action plan, for us, we actually have our clients write it out. This is from our updated manual. It's the blueprint for success, and we have them ask and answer these questions for themselves. They don't have to turn this back into us. But in this sample that you have here, we ask our clients to complete this, and this little blueprint sets them up for exercising, but more importantly, again, for those moments when they don't feel like exercising. And completing this form on their own gives them, again, perceived choice. So now I'm not just an exercise authority telling you what to do and why you need to do it. You know why you want to do it. And so in those situations, you are setting the tone and you are in control of this plan for yourself. Next slide, please. And we know that physicians have goals for weight management. We have goals for the amount of time that you will spend doing this workout. Of course, those are the guidelines that we need to have an effective outcome. But there are other desired outcomes from long-term exercise and consistent exercise aside from those initial goals. The first one is self-efficacy. And this is really, I think I've said that a bunch of times already tonight, but after the first 12 weeks of regular exercise, our goal for clients is for them to say, what can I do next? Can I do some aerobic activity? Could I walk a couple of miles a day? Could I pick up a hand weight? Maybe I could go to an exercise class. We want them to have the confidence and the control over their bodies to say, what can I do next to continue their exercise journey? An alignment of values and actions, now in alignment. Before they were out of alignment, now they're in after building that routine of exercise. With recommended consistency, we want to make sure that that shift has happened from not just I want to be healthy, but I am getting healthier and I am living a healthy lifestyle. Improved quality of living. With consistency, we know that the fatigue of the fatty liver patient will improve with regular resistance training. And we want activities of daily living to also improve, not just in quantity, but in quality of daily living. And our last desired outcome, creating joyful experiences, because we know many, many times over when we have joyful memories, pleasant memories associated with movement, we want to do more of them. Again, creating that adherence for lifestyle change. Next slide. If you have any questions, I'm ready.
Hi, Chris. We don't have any questions right now, but if folks want to put them into the chat, Maya and I will read them. I do have a couple of questions, though, for Dr. Jerome Zapatka, if she would join us again. Great presentation, Chris. Thank you so much. Learned a lot. In fact, I'm exercising right now as we speak. I know you can see me and I'm not.
Me too.
Dr. Zapatka, we have a couple of questions for you. Katie asks, are all carbs created equal, and how low is low carb? That's question number one.
That is very interesting. No, all carbs are not created equally. If you think about starches and sugars, they will affect your rate of insulin increase differently. I guess the greatest way to compare it would be to take maybe broccoli, which is a carbohydrate, and chocolate or candy, which is a carbohydrate. They're both going to raise your insulin level differently So I guess there are different types of carbs, absolutely. And then as far as low carb, what defines low carb? It's different among different schools of thought. I mean, if you're thinking about a ketogenic diet, that would be less than 50 grams of carbs a day. Other low carb would be considered less than maybe 100 to 130 grams a day would be considered low carb. Ketogenic would be less than 50 grams of carbs per day.
Thank you, Dr. Zapatka. And Julie asks, how is the general medical community receiving this?
Receiving, I want to make sure I understand the question. Receiving what?
That's how the question stops. I don't know if Julie can clarify, but my assumption is, are they stuck on the old way of thinking? That's what I was
Yes, and that's a really interesting. Yeah, this brings up an entirely other subject. I'm actually giving a talk tomorrow morning at the Heritage Valley Health System Board of Directors about this very subject, because even within our own hospital facility, we're still recommending consistent carbohydrate diets for diabetics. We're still recommending low-fat diet for our cardiac patients. And so I think, most facilities are just beginning to grasp this concept that the low-fat diet recommendations are not right for people with metabolic illnesses. And we really need to be looking at the types of fats that we're eating. And we need to be looking at the amount of carbohydrates that we're eating. If we think about all of the metabolic issues, fatty liver, diabetes, prediabetes, they're all part of that insulin resistance syndrome, where we know that we need to be doing some form of carbohydrate reduction, and certainly making sure that we're getting the healthy types of fats like extra virgin olive oil. Now we consider butter to be a healthy fat, avocado oil, those types of fats, avocados. So yes, it's been a huge transition. I will put a statement out about there's a new society called the Society for Metabolic Health Practitioners. It is an international organization of researchers and clinicians who are of the same mindset that we need to be training physicians and healthcare providers how to transition to this new way of thinking as far as lowering doing therapeutic carbohydrate reduction is what we would call that now.
Perfect. We have another question. Rebecca asks, what about plant-based diets for NAFLD?
I cannot say that I'm an expert on plant-based diets. Maybe some of the other hepatologists that will be speaking later can comment about any recent studies regarding that. I think a part of the issue with the plant-based diet is really being able to get enough protein, adequate protein in a reasonable amount of calories. I think that's part of the issue. Is how much food it takes to get the protein requirements that you need. So I look forward to hearing what any of the other speakers have to say about plant-based diets and fatty liver.
Terrific. That's the end of the questions that we have right now. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Balakrishnan, unless Dr. or Kriskoski has any feedback.
Wonderful. So keep the questions coming, even if we move on to other people's talks. If you have a question related to nutrition or physical activity, you can always throw them up in the chat box and we'll address them. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ganesh, who'll be giving a talk on the living liver donor transplantation. She's medical director of the Living Donor Program at UPMC Thomas Starzl Transplant Institute and assistant professor whose research interests include living donor liver transplants and drug metabolism in patients post-living patient transplant. In addition, she conducts research on the safety and preliminary efficacy of donor-derived regulatory dendritic cell infusion and immunosuppression withdrawal in living donor transplant recipients. She's going to share her work with the Living Liver Donor Program. So I look forward to hearing her talk.
transplant, we cannot forget Dr. Starzl, who is the father of liver transplantation. This is the 40th anniversary of Dr. Starzl, Thomas E. Starzl, who is the father of liver transplantation. The liver transplant is the miracle of modern medicine. This is the established and the only definitive treatment for end-stage liver disease. Even though liver transplantation was established in 1981, the living donor liver transplantation did not start until 1999. The survival following liver transplantation is pretty good, which is 1 year survival is 87 to 93%, and 5 year survival is more than 75%, which is even better for living donor liver transplantation. Why do we have to think about shifting the paradigm to living donor liver transplantation? Why is this important? Because the disparity between the number of patients on the wait list and the number of available organs continue to grow each year. The total number of living donor liver transplant in the entire US is still less than 10% of the total number of liver transplants performed. It is time to shift the paradigm. And the number of living donor liver transplant in US has not increased and is still very much underutilized. And we all understand and know that the living donor liver transplantation, the donor gives a piece of their liver to the recipient, and the liver regenerates both in the donor and the recipients in 12 weeks. The donor can be either biologically related to the recipient or could be an altruistic or non-biologic. And I just want to show that this is the current status of living donor liver transplant in the US. The number of patients on the wait list, this is the red line shows the number of patients on the wait list, and the dark blue line is the number of deceased donor liver transplant, and the light blue line is the number of living donor liver transplant in US. So the number of patients on the wait list is anywhere between 14 to 16,000 for the last decade, and the number of patients who receive the deceased donor liver transplant is no more than 6,000 to 7,000 each year, and the number of living donor liver transplant is no more than 400 to 500 each year. So as you can clearly see, the number of living donor liver transplant in US is clearly underutilized. And this translates to the number of living donor liver transplant at USA is still proportionately low compared to the number of liver transplant, which is the total number of liver transplant, which is less than 10% of the total liver transplants done. So the median waiting time in each center, especially at UPMC, for the patients waiting on the wait list has been going up significantly each year. In 2015, this is number of these are the months. The patients waiting on the wait list, the median waiting time has been going up each year. And also the median meld, the median meld at which the patients get a deceased donor liver transplant has also been significantly going up each year. That means that the patients get the liver transplant, the deceased donor, at the point in time where they are very much sick. So the median meld has been going up, where the median meld at the point where the patients get a liver transplant at UPMC is around 30. And as you can see, the median time of waiting time has also significantly gone up also. What does this translate to? This translates to 15 to 25% of a chance of never making it to transplant for anyone at any point in time waiting on the wait list. Longer waiting period before receiving a transplant. A more debilitated state by the time a transplant is performed. A longer and more difficult recovery time post-transplant. And not all patients that would benefit are listed or offered transplant. This is what it translates to a patient who is on the wait list. This is the consequence of the wait list. So as I said before, this is the living donor liver transplant, which is very much underutilized in US. There is a spike in 2001. There were 500 living donor liver transplants, and currently there are 500. So it's grossly underutilized in US compared to the deceased donor liver transplant. And in the Western countries, the number of living donor liver transplant is not increased, but the demands of the organs continue to grow. In Asia, the problem was significantly and successfully addressed with the increase in the living donor liver transplant. But in US, in Eastern countries, these are the number of living donor liver transplants. But in US, the number of living donor liver transplants still remain significantly low. The number of hospitals in US that have done more than 100 living donor liver transplants is still only 15 hospitals have done more than 100 living donor liver transplants in total. And the UPMC is one of them, UCSF, Mayo, Rochester, New York Presbyterian. These are the hospitals who have done more than 100. But the number of centers, compared to the number of centers in US, there are more than 150 centers, which are transplant centers in US, but only 15 hospitals have done more than 100 living donor liver transplants. And there are, in 2020, this is the volume of the living donor liver transplants in the entire US. So the UPMC, we did 91 in 2020, and UT San Antonio did 38. And so this is the comparative volumes across the United States of America in 2020. So as you can see, the number of living donor liver transplants is still significantly lower. So there is a huge gap in the knowledge, and there is a significant underutilization of living donor liver transplant despite the benefits. And this is the volume of living donor liver transplant compared to the deceased donor liver transplant in UPMC. So in 2020, we did 91 living donor liver transplant and 56 deceased donor liver transplant. So the national average of any transplant center compared to their deceased donor is around 6%, but in UPMC, 60% of our total volume of transplants were comprised of living donor liver transplant. We made a concerted effort to increase the outcome, to improvise the outcomes and increase the volume of a living donor, because the living donor liver transplant offers better outcomes and also increase the accessibility of transplant to the patients on the wait list at the right time. So we had made a concerted effort as a team, as a center, to achieve that. And because of that, we had increased the living donor liver transplant volumes effectively for the benefit of the patient. And you can see at the UPMC, it's the same slide, we did 91 living donor liver transplant in 2020. And as far as the donor risk, compared to the UPMC data, we have not had any donor deaths at UPMC. There is no cases of liver failure, or none of the donors required any transplants. And overall complication rate is 19.5%. Major complication rate is 8.8%. The mean length of stay is anywhere between 4 to 7 days at UPMC. Compared to the national data, the major complication rate is 30%, and overall complication rate is 30%, and major complication rate is 10%. The donor outcomes at UPMC, reoperation rate is 6.2%. Biliary leak and biloma is around 1.2%, and recovery is 5 to 7 days in the hospital, 4 to 6 weeks desk job, 10 to 12 weeks physical job, 8 to 90% by 3 months post donation. They're back to their baseline. And what is new with the living donor liver transplantation at UPMC? We have done ABO incompatible and also liver pad exchange, extended criteria, altruistic, anonymous donation, and also champion program. The number of anonymous living donor liver transplant at UPMC by the year has gone up significantly. And this is because of our education and awareness, because of the public campaign, which we reached out to the entire nation talking about living donation. In 2019, 20% of our LDLT transplants were with an anonymous donor due to countrywide education campaign launched in October of 2018. We have also done liver paired exchanges. We have done 11 pairs of paired exchange from the year 2019 October through present. The swaps, these are called liver paired exchange. They were done in different combination. This was possible because of the altruistic donor. Out of the total cases, the exchanges initiated by an altruistic donor, all of them were involving an ABO incompatible donor recipient pair with the matched donors for each recipient. The non-directed donor was blood type O in all of those cases. And the second recipient in these cases were chosen from the wait list. They were matched based on weight, BMI, MELD, graft size, and anatomy. Both the pairs underwent transplants within a week of each other. So this was only possible because of an altruistic donor. The person came forward and they were O blood type, and then we were able to match them with a different pair. So we have done at least 11 of them. And liver paired exchange or liver swap is possible because recipients would otherwise have no option even with the donor. Altruistic donors were used for the first time in USA for liver swaps. 11 pairs, which are 22 lives, were saved thus far. We also have a champion program, which is unique to UPMC. The conceptual framework of the Living Donor Champion Program consists of a multi-pronged approach utilizing the family, the extended network, and the community and the support system. It is a structured education and awareness program, including targeted education, utilizing the social media, and incorporating education webinars, and also with our advocacy groups, including CLA, UNOS, Donate Life, and CORE. And Living Donor Champion program has a multiple components, including Champion Toolkit, Facebook support page, Living Donor Town Hall, information sessions, and Facebook page. And we also have the support from the Champion Ambassador with the one-on-one coaching, Living Donor education and information session through the Facebook page, webinar, public education efforts. The most key part is the ambassador who supports the champion through one-on-one. The champion is a person who's identified by the recipient who's on the wait list or who's undergoing the evaluation, and this champion is a identified person within the recipient support group, and the ambassador works through the champion, who then utilizes the multiple resources offered by us in identifying a donor for the recipient. And this has been an extremely successful program because it takes the pressure off of the recipient in asking for help. Instead, the champion works with us in identifying a donor for the recipient instead of the recipient doing all the work. And our Living Donor Champion program has multiple components, including the champion events, the social media, the champion support group, and the champion website. And we started this on June of 2017, and we have the data until May of 2021, and we have had several champion events, including town hall and workshops, and we have also several social media engagements, champion support. Currently, our ambassador is working with more than 100 champions, and we also have a robust champion website. And because of the Living Donor program offering early access to transplant for the patients on the wait list, we have significantly reduced the transplant patient mortality on the wait list and increased the access to transplant for the patients on the wait list. Our transplant waitlist mortality has significantly reduced, as you can see on the bar graph. And we also have increased the number of patients who got transplant in the last few years. The transplant rate also doubled, as you can see. And the recipient, this is the recipient and the graft survival and the patient survival. The red is the deceased and the live is the blue. And as you can see, there is a significant survival benefit and the graft survival benefit with the Living Donor liver transplant, as both the curves show. And also there is a significant reduction in the cost and the resource utilization data between the Living Donor liver transplant and the deceased donor liver transplant, where the number of outpatient labs, the pre-transplant costs, the inpatient perioperative costs, the total post-transplant costs, and the reduction in the inpatient readmission rates, and the outpatient pre and the post-transplant costs, as you can see, compared to both the living donor and the deceased donor liver transplant. Not only the living donor liver transplant increases the accessibility to transplant, reduces the mortality on the wait list, improves the quality of life, but also reduces the morbidity and improves the quality of life for patients on the wait list. and that reduces the retransplant rates and also improves the outcome. And also there are better outcomes on patients with the living donor liver transplant, as you can see. And so in summary, living donor liver transplant comprised 53.6% of UPMC's total transplant. The transplant rate increased from 44 to 103 in 2019. So the criteria for living donor liver transplant should be based on ability to provide a survival advantage and the quality of life improvement. And living donor liver transplant is not the last resort, but rather the first and the better.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful overview on a very relevant topic for patients with advanced fatty liver disease, and a very complicated topic. So now switching gears to kids. Unfortunately, NAFLD is a disease that spares no one, and we're seeing increasing rates of NAFLD in our children, in our pediatric population. So we have Dr. Mavis joining us to talk about pediatric NAFLD and NASH. She's a pediatric gastroenterologist and hepatologist at Duke Health, who sees kids of all ages and with a variety of liver diseases. She also sees patients with improperly functioning small bowel and intestinal failure requiring long-term nutritional support. Her specific areas of interest are liver transplantation, portal hypertension, and Fontan-associated liver disease.
Thank you, Maya. Thank you, everyone, for joining. I am one of the pediatric hepatologists at Duke, and you'll hear from my dietitian later, Miss Leslie later, but we do take care of a lot of patients with liver disease. And so we're going to go through a brief overview of pediatric fatty liver disease, which is a little bit different than adults. Next slide, please. I have these disclosures, Speaker Bureau, but none of these have anything to do with my presentation today. Next slide. So today we're going to recognize the prevalence and natural history of pediatric non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, describe the screening guidelines, and then review the diagnosis and treatment. Next slide. So a brief overview about pediatric non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, or NAFLD. Next. NAFLD is actually an umbrella of disease. It includes non-alcoholic fatty liver, NASH, or non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, which has inflammation and fibrosis, or NAFLD with fibrosis, or even cirrhosis. So you can kind of see there that the majority, 2/3 of patients have non-alcoholic fatty liver, but even as much as 10 to 15% have non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, where there's already more ongoing inflammation, or even up to cirrhosis. Next. The spectrum of pediatric fatty liver disease is kind of broad. This was looked at in the NASH Clinical Research Network that includes 176 children from 8 sites in the US with their age 6 to 17 years of age. And you can see that 80% of these patients already had NASH at the time of biopsy. And 30% had stage 2 and stage 3 fibrosis, which is more significant fibrosis than one would expect. Their BMI percentiles were around 99th percentile, or a mean BMI of 33% with a range of 18 to 58. Remembering in pediatrics that the BMI ranges are not as helpful as the percentile is. Next. Some of the clinical features associated with more severe pediatric non-alcoholic steatohepatitis is increase in abdominal obesity or increased waist circumference. We kind of heard a little bit about insulin resistance. We see prediabetes or type 2 diabetes. Looking at race and ethnicity, Hispanics are more likely than white, and then a lot more likely than Black. There are some genetic components to it. Increasing in age in peri and postpubertal patients, and then increasing in liver enzymes, specifically the ALT of greater than 80. We also see it with some elevated triglycerides. Next. So what are the future implications for children with NASH? So we know that NASH-related cirrhosis in the US alone has increased 6-fold over the last decade in adults. It's now the second leading cause for liver transplant in adults and may become the main leading cause for transplant. It's most rapidly growing indication for liver transplant related to hepatocellular carcinoma. So if we're looking at all this, we don't know what it means in children, but the trends in adults are concerning. Next. So let's look at the prevalence of pediatric non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Next. So in looking at this, NAFLD is the most common cause of pediatric liver disease. We have clinics that are full of patients being evaluated or cared for with NAFLD. There are no studies describing the incidence of NAFLD in children. Next. but we do know it parallels the obesity epidemic that we're seeing. And so there's been a 2.7-fold increase in NAFLD from the 1980s to the current era because of the epidemic in obesity. Next. It does vary with age of the child, gender, race, ethnicity, and the BMI. There's an increase in prevalence in children with certain risk factors such as prediabetes, type 2 diabetes, obstructive sleep apnea, which you may get asked about, and then hypopituitarism. Next slide. It also depends on the population being screened when we look at the prevalence. Is it the general population or is it more the high-risk population? And what screening methods are we using to determine if kids have an NAFLD? Next slide. So what we do know is that in the ages of 2 to 4 years of age, there's 0.7% prevalence in children of NAFLD. Now that's not that much, but by the teenage years, there's already a 17% prevalence. And if you're looking at, and that's general population, if you're looking at obese children and going by the ALT elevation or the liver labs, you're anywhere from 30 to 40% prevalence of NAFLD in pediatrics, which is very concerning. Next. In patients that are 11 to 22 years of age and Hispanic, there's a 4-fold increase. You can see there that Asian children have about a 10%, white children 8.6, and then Black children are more protected at 1.5, but it is known that after puberty, they're more at risk for diabetes. Next, please. So children with type 2 diabetes had about a 50% prevalence of elevated ALT. Obstructive sleep apnea, like we said, was associated in 2 pediatric studies. And then children with hypopituitarism also have an increased risk, and even cirrhosis for those patients. Next. So kind of summarizing everything, the prevalence of pediatric NAFLD is paralleling the growing prevalence of obesity in children. The prevalence also varies with the population screen, the level of risk, and any modality that we use to detect it, whether it be labs or imaging. And it is higher in certain subpopulations, such as overweight obese children. Males are more at risk than females, different ethnic groups, with Hispanics being the most at risk, and then patients that have prediabetes or type 2 diabetes, obstructive sleep apnea, or hypothalamic dysfunction. Next. Let's talk a little bit about the natural history. Next slide, please. So we're taking a retrospective look here. These are small studies, but one study was looking at 5 pediatric subjects based on liver biopsy with a follow-up of 41 plus or minus about 2 years, 41 months plus or minus 2 years. All 5 subjects had increased fibrosis on the repeat liver biopsy from a stage of 0.2 up to stage 2. So that's very concerning. If you look at the other study, we looked at 18 pediatric subjects with biopsy-proven non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. Remember, that has the more inflammation and plus or minus fibrosis. With 28 months follow-up, only about 40% had no change in fibrosis, but about 40% had progression in fibrosis, whereas only 15 to 20% had regression in fibrosis. So those aren't good outcomes for us. Next, please. Another look, we did the TONIC trial, which is vitamin E versus metformin versus placebo, and this was a prospective look at it all. So there was about 47 kids in the placebo control that did nutrition and physical activity. And then if you look at the TONIC control, looking at using vitamin E versus metformin, there was some histological improvements based on change in NAFLD activity score level, but the mean change in ALT was more impressive with a decrease in 35. And you can see there was some fibrosis improvement, some steatosis improvement, and then some inflammation improvement as well. Next, please. There is increased risk of mortality in pediatric non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. This study looked at 66 children with a mean follow-up of about 6 years. And it showed that 2 patients died and 2 patients required liver transplant. And so when you're looking at your observed versus expected, it was a significant change, letting us know that patients with fatty liver disease do have an increased risk of mortality. We've always known that. We've known that about the adults for a while, but in pediatrics, it's true as well. Next slide, please. This is another study looking at more adults, but it's got 229 adults with biopsy-proven non-alcoholic fatty liver disease compared to the regular population. And with NAFLD mortality, you had an increased overall mortality increase, cardiovascular risk increase, hepatocellular carcinoma increased risk, and infectious. Again, this is not good news for us in pediatrics. Next, please. There wasn't an increase in mortality in the study, but or in fibrosis, but fibrosis stage 3 and 4, irrespective of their activity score, had an increased mortality. So the scores of 5 to 8 did not have an increased mortality. So as misspoke, sorry about that. Next slide, please. So is there an aggressive phenotype for pediatric non-alcoholic fatty liver disease? We've kind of grouped it all together for a while, but we're starting to wonder who are the patients that may have a lot more aggressive that we need to be more to try and identify them earlier. And this is looking at a study comparing severely obese adults versus adolescents at bariatric surgery. And you can see there that the adolescents, so there's 24 in each group, but the 63% of the adolescents had definitive NASH versus only 25% of the adults. Their activity score was higher. The adolescents had 83% of them had fibrosis, whereas only about 30% of the adults did. And their overall mean fibrosis score was higher. So this is concerning that there is a more aggressive phenotype in certain adolescents over adults. Next slide, please. So what we kind of know in all of this is that there's very limited data with small series. We're trying to extrapolate adult data to tell us about kids, but this may be insufficient. As we talked about, there may be a more aggressive version in pediatric NAFLD. We have early onset obesity in pediatrics, increased severity of obesity. And then the other thing that we don't talk about as much, but should be, is intrauterine exposure to maternal obesity and insulin resistance. We're starting to realize that your risk of fatty liver disease actually happens while mom is pregnant with the child. Next slide. Talking about the screening. Next, please. So we always talk about ALT, AST. What does this all mean? If you ever look at a lab report and you have a pediatric patient, we realize that the numbers they use there may be 40 or 50 for the upper limit of normal. These are actually determined by regional laboratories using local populations for norm. It does not exclude patients that are overweight or obese or those with liver disease. And so they just put together a group of patients to say, here's our norm. Well, looking at this from a pediatrics perspective, we actually looked at the National Haynes group, adolescent group of 12 to 17 years of age to determine what is actually normal for boys and girls. This excluded those that were overweight, obese, and those with underlying liver disease. And actually an ALT of 25 to 26 for boys and ALT of 22 for girls is what is considered normal. And these are those numbers that we use on the pediatric side. We don't actually go by what each individual hospital range says. Next, please. Now, we use ALT and AST, but there's a lot of limitations. ALT is well known that it doesn't correlate well with what the biopsy looks like. So if we take a biopsy based on the ALT, we can't tell you what we're going to see. As well as, excuse me, sorry about that. As well as some studies suggest that AST and GGT are better correlated with fibrosis. We've seen ALT changes even with placebo. So even when we don't make an intervention, we can see ALT changes. We also know that ALT fluctuates over time, and it can't differentiate between the non-alcoholic steatohepatitis with the inflammation and just plain out non-alcoholic fatty liver. Next. Next, please. Looking at ultrasound, we love ultrasound on pediatrics. It's non-invasive, it doesn't require sedation, and most kids can tolerate it. So it's very non-invasive. Some of the bad parts of it is not very sensitive or specific with low degrees of steatosis or fat in the liver. So we don't recommend it for screening in the NASPGHAN guidelines that came out in 2018. Ultrasound also can't differentiate between NASH and non-alcoholic fatty liver. Next, please. We're looking at some new advanced imaging techniques that are out. We've got some ultrasound-based techniques of shear wave and radiofrequency. There's MRI, different ones. However, in pediatrics, these are not widely available. And remember, we're talking about kids. So putting kids in an MRI scanner, they can't always tolerate that time, the noise, the closed space. And so having to do sedation to do these studies is not a good thing either. And so we're always trying to look at new ways for non-invasive testing, but also in the environment of the pediatric patient. Next, please. We do recommend that screening. All kids should be screened between the ages of 9 and 11. Children greater than the 95th percentile, for sure. Children between the 85th and 94th percentile with a BMI with other risk factors such as central adiposity, insulin resistance, prediabetes or dyslipidemia or sleep apnea, or even a family history of NAFLD or NASH. Next, please. Earlier screening may be considered in younger patients with risk factors like we talked about, such as severe obesity, family history, or hypopituitarism. And you may even consider screening of siblings and parents and children with NAFLD if they have known risk factors. So there are times that I diagnose a child with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and I suggest to the parent that, based on what you're telling me with your own risk factors, you should go be evaluated. It's not always the parent, and then we diagnose the child. Next, please. Currently, our best option is ALT, but we know it has limitations. We do use the 22 for girls and 26 for boys for cutoff. If it's persistently elevated for more than 3 months or twice the upper limit of normal, we think kids should be evaluated for non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, And if there's an ALT of greater than 80, this is increased concern and what makes it more of a urgent workup for us. Next. We do not recommend ultrasound like we talked about as a screening test. Your child may get an ultrasound to rule out other things, but we usually don't use it as a screening test for non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. We do recommend follow-up screening if one is not diagnosed, so repeating the ALT every 2 to 3 years if risk factors remain unchanged, or considering repeating screening sooner if clinical risk factors of NAFLD are increased. Next, please. So diagnosing it. Next, please. It is a diagnosis of exclusion. This is looking at a lot of different diseases that we rule out when we see elevated liver enzymes. Next. We use a combination of the lab tests, imaging modalities, and sometimes we do have to use a liver biopsy as that's our gold standard. Next, please. This is just kind of looking at what a biopsy looks like and what we're looking at under the microscope. And you can see here, the big thing to take away is that there is a pediatric pattern which is different than what you see in the adult pattern on a liver biopsy when we see NASH and NAFLD. Next, please. Liver biopsy is mainly used to quantify steatosis. Steatosis or fat in more than 5% of the liver cells is abnormal. And so that's where we look at the NAFLD activity score. Doing this with imaging can sometimes be helpful, but imaging, as we talked about, availability is not ideal at this point. Next, please. It's hard to distinguish NAFLD from NASH when you have obesity based on obesity severity or your metabolic dysregulation or even your blood work. NASH is more common in those with an ALT greater than 80, but it's not a slam dunk. And those with panhypopituitarism or type 2 diabetes have more association with NASH. We talked about liver biopsy as our gold standard, and there's certain requirements that we like on that biopsy so we can diagnose it. Next, please. Liver biopsy considerations is something that we take as very important. We have to get a liver biopsy in a pediatric patient. We have to use anesthesia, and so we don't take it lightly, but it is very safe in children, even if they are overweight. We sometimes will use our radiologist in certain situations, but it is considered safe. Deciding the optimal timing of biopsy is important to work with at the family decision, and then it can help us diagnose not only NAFLD, but it can help with diagnosing other liver disease or ruling out other liver diseases. Next, please. This is more looking at the presence of fibrosis and kind of what we look at. Again, it tells us that those with an ALT greater than 80 predicts advanced fibrosis more. Next slide. So we've talked a lot about benefits and limitations, but each thing that we can do, each diagnostic approach, whether it be labs, imaging, or biopsy, have their benefits and their limitations. Unfortunately, as of now, liver biopsy is still our gold standard. It also allows us to rule out other diseases, and we don't have any great markers, non-invasive markers at this time, but hopefully in the future. Next, please. Again, imaging, we're trying to determine fibrosis. We still don't have a good thing for this. We're doing further validation and studies are required. Next slide. So recommendations for diagnosing, we're trying to exclude other liver diseases when evaluating a patient with suspected NAFLD. We do consider liver biopsy in children at risk for NASH and or advanced fibrosis. We do not recommend ultrasound to determine or quantify the steatosis, and CT is not recommended to determine steatosis due to exposure and radiation. Next slide, please. Last thing we'll talk about is treatment. Next, please. The goals of treatment are pretty simple. We would love to have regression of the non-alcoholic fatty liver disease defined as decreasing the steatosis, the inflammation, or fibrosis. We would love to have resolution of NASH, which is determined by liver histology. As you can tell, both of these would require repeat liver biopsy. Next slide. Liver histology and our assessment of that is looking at the change in fibrosis or scar tissue over time as a reasonable treatment outcome in children over longer periods of time. but we don't love doing a lot of repeat liver biopsies. Next slide, please. We look at the ALT. If there's a decrease in ALT, we think that's overall associated with improvements in NAFLD, but again, we don't know what's meaningful. Next slide, please. Ultrasound's not reliable, as we talked about. MRI is promising, but we need more validations and we need more available. Next slide, please. So we have to go to some other treatment goals too. We're looking at decreasing their central fat adiposity. We're looking at improving their dyslipidemia, their hypertriglyceridemia, their insulin resistance, and blood pressure. So now we're looking at other markers outside of the liver. Next slide. Our biggest thing we focus on is lifestyle and dietary supplements. That's why you're hearing from those specialists, because they're extremely helpful. There are some medications, but they're not as readily available on the pediatric side as they are in adults. And in rare cases, or extreme cases, I should say, not rare, we use surgery. Next slide, please. Lifestyle modifications are still our number one. We work to improve diet and increase physical activity. This is the main thing that we work on in pediatrics and children, and that's, you'll hear a little bit about from Leslie as well, but we really try and get them active and adjust their diet when they're young and teach them healthy habits at the young age. Next slide. We try and avoid sugar-sweetened beverages. You've already heard a lot about that. Well-balanced diet, vigorous exercise, and limiting screen time. That is the hardest thing in this day and age, is limiting the screen time. Next slide. We don't currently have any available recommendations on peds. There are studies going on. As I talked about, surgery may be an option for selected individuals in severe cases. It's not our go-to, but we are using it some in peds. Next. Thank you for joining, and I hope you learned something. I'm open for any questions.
We don't have any questions right now, but if people do, put them in the chat and Dr. Balakrishnan and myself will field those. Thank you,
Yeah,
Dr. Mavis.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mavis. I do have a quick question for you, which might be relevant to some of our audience members. So if I'm a parent and I have NAFLD, should I screen my child for NAFLD?
That's a great question. And that's one of that we recommend talking to the pediatrician about. We still recommend kids getting their annual pediatric screens or health, wellness kids. And if your child is overweight, absolutely, but it's something to make sure the pediatrician is aware that there's a family history of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, because even if your child's not overweight or doesn't have any of the other things like type 2 diabetes, obstructive sleep apnea, or things like that, they may still go ahead and get screening labs either early, depending on the age, or between that 9 and 11 years of age, like we talked about. So it's important to make sure the pediatrician or your regular family doctor is aware.
Great, wonderful. Thanks so much. So that was a perfect segue into the next topic, which is pediatric nutrition. And we just heard how nutrition is really the centerpiece of treatment of pediatric NAFLD and NASH. We're going to hear from Leslie Stanford, who holds a master's in science and is a licensed registered dietitian. So we're going to hear from her about nutrition for children and teens with NAFLD.
Hi, good evening, and thank you for inviting me. So we're going to start today and talk a little bit about nutrition in regard to what we do in what we know from the research and what we do in our clinic. Next slide, please. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about what research shows. And then in the last portion of my talk, we're going to talk a little bit about the stigma of weight for children and teenagers and what we as healthcare providers can do to look at our own setting and what we as consumers of healthcare can demand and request for pediatric patients. Next slide. I have no disclaimers. I'd just like to thank Alicia Mavis. We work closely together at Duke, and I appreciate her support. Next slide. So we want to start and talk about what we know. And like many subjects, there are certain things we know, and there's lots of questions we'd like to answer. This is what we know. Next slide, please. NASPGHAN, the North American Society of Pediatric Gastroenterologists, Hepatologists, and Nutrition, came up with a clinical practice guideline. And this guideline looked at a review of everything that we know currently from the European community and from the North American community about what we know in regard to treatment. Next slide. And so this 1917 guidelines came up with 3 lifestyle recommendations, and that's what we're currently following. Improvement in diet and increase in physical activity is our first line treatment for all children and teens. We want an avoidance of sugar sweetened beverages, and we want consistent exercise and activity. We work to increasing moderate to high intensity physical activity as tolerated, and to limit screen time to less than 2 hours per day. And this is actually a photograph taken in Durham of our Bull City Fit program, which is our comprehensive childhood obesity program that's associated with Duke University. And this is a photograph of them playing before the pandemic. Next slide, please. Just like Dr. Mavis said, bariatric surgery can be considered in select pediatric patients. The general guidelines for discussion would be BMI of 35 or greater, that they would have comorbidities. And it is a conversation that we have with select patients. And so that's different than many of us thought maybe 10 or 15 years ago. Next slide. So when looking at what the studies have said to pediatric patients, and we're talking about children and teenagers, there have been some recent studies looking at recommendations for a Mediterranean diet. And using a Mediterranean diet with children is a positive approach, because we're looking at what foods to add. And so the foods that we're adding go back to the previous talk about nutrition. We're decreasing processed food and increasing real or whole foods with a Mediterranean diet. Next slide. And so when we're looking at a Mediterranean diet, it's plenty of fruits and vegetables in their natural form. It's some whole grain breads, potatoes, beans, and nuts and seeds, again, in their whole form. Olive oil is a primary source of fat. Dairy products, eggs, fish, and poultry in low to moderate amounts. And with our pediatric patients in the clinic, we spend a lot of time going over what's an appropriate portion size. For our younger children, we use the Choose My Plate program, and we're showing their caregivers, parents, grandparents, whoever comes to the appointment with them, what's an appropriate size of food. We're also talking about minimal processing. That's the same thing that was discussed in our first talk today. We want to move away from processed food and move to whole foods. As you can imagine, what lots of little children like would be chicken nuggets and other things that are processed. We're also limiting added sugars and sugary beverages, limiting some limits on sodium, limits on high processed food and refined carbohydrates, and fatty or processed meats. So we're moving toward a healthy diet. Next slide. In a recent study by Jeff Schwimmer and colleagues, they looked at a study with adolescent boys. And so they were looking at 40 adolescent boys. They were in the age group of 11 to 16, so that prepubertal to pubertal age. And they put them in 2 groups. One group followed a low sugar diet. Many guidelines recommend less than 5%, and in this study, they chose less than 3% of daily total calories from sugar over 8 weeks of time. And what they saw when they went back and looked at biochemical markers is the ALT had been reduced in the intervention group from an average of 103 to an average of 61. So looking at low sugar is an important concept in meeting the guidelines of lifestyle modification. And that's something that we work hard at to help families understand sources of sugar, help families understand changes in beverages, and where they can do this. Many of the studies in pediatrics looking at diet have a small sample size. And so we look at these studies, but realize that the sample size is small, but it does give us promise. Next slide, please. We're looking at serving healthy beverages. And in doing that, next slide, we want water as a primary beverage. It's a question that we ask our pediatric patients and their families every single time they're in clinic. How much water are you drinking? Do you take a water bottle to school? With the pandemic, there have been changes in water fountains. And so is there a filling station? Is there a place you can fill up your water bottle a second time? Is water your primary beverage? And it's we also ask about sugar sweetened beverages, but we start off with what healthy things are you doing? And then we gather some information about sugar sweetened beverages. The next slide, please. And I'm hoping that this will work. So I'm going to ask the people who are taking care of our IT if they can click on this hyperlink and see if we can open up Potter the Otter. We'll see if that's possible. So it's not possible to open that up at this point in time. Potter the Otter is my new favorite book. And I'm sorry you can't see it, but if you go online, you can find Potter the Otter. It is a book that we're able to look at in clinic on our computer screens. And with each page of Potter the Otter, the top part is written in English and the lower part is written in Spanish. We have many Spanish-speaking parents in our clinic, and we have an interpreter with us, but we can go through and read Potter the Otter with our smaller kids. And Potter the Otter likes to drink water, and he has friends named Toto who likes to drink soda, and he has friends named Moose and Goose who like to drink juice, and he's trying to convince them to drink water. So I strongly encourage you to look at this book because it's a nice way to have a positive approach when talking to younger children. And we usually get a smile on a face, and that's a good thing when we're talking about diet modification. Next slide, please. Here's Potter the Otter again. Next slide. And one of the things that we've seen, and I suppose everybody else who's working with patients who are struggling with weight gain, is during the pandemic, we can look at our growth charts and our electronic medical record, and we can see a difference from March of 2020 until today. And so we see that, and the studies have shown this as well. This is a recent study that was reported in the Journal of the American Medical Association, and youth 5 to 11 gained about 5 pounds more during the pandemic than the previous time period. So they've looked at the time period and mark the months, and then they looked in 2018 to 2019. During the same period of time, 16 to 17-year-olds gained more than 2 pounds in the previous time period. We've seen this in our clinic. We've seen younger kids gaining more weight, and it doesn't take much to figure out why. They sat at a computer screen for virtual school. There was limitations in parks and gyms and pools being opened at the beginning of the pandemic. There was less time to play outside and more time sitting at a computer screen. So at this point in time, what we're working on, our families in clinic, is we've seen the weight gain. Now let's get back to healthy progress. Let's get back to things that we can work on together. Next slide. And we're trying to find new ways to reach families. Bull City Fit is associated with our comprehensive obesity program for children at Duke, and it can be accessed by anybody. So you guys can look at this, and they have virtual cooking classes, and they also have virtual activity follow-alongs. And so the follow-alongs are short exercises that can be done in a small space, and short exercises that can be done with families. Next slide. There's been a recent study that was published, and the study was done by nurses from the University of Delaware, the University of Maryland, and the University of South Carolina. And they looked at a correlation between bedtime and obesity. They weren't specifically looking at pediatric patients with NAFL, but the study's interesting to look at. So it's not just sleep hygiene. They are seeing increases in obesity with children who had inconsistent bedtime. So it's something to for us to ask in clinic, and it's also something to be asked in primary care, whether that's in a private setting or a health department setting. What time do you put your child to bed? And we know there were disruptions in sleep during the first parts of the pandemic, but consistent bedtime seems to be an advantage in combating childhood obesity. Next slide. We also look at serving sizes, and we spend a lot of time with age-appropriate materials in our clinic, looking at what's an appropriate serving size and helping families and children see that. We use Choose My Plate, which is part of the USDA program, and we also use their portion distortion program. We can pull that up in clinic and look at it, and we're just trying to look at what's an appropriate size. For example, you can see here a half-cup serving is considered a serving of ice cream, but many cartons now are describing more of 2/3 of a cup. So we are always helping families to look at what's an appropriate serving size. Next slide. So what can I do with the patient in front of me? And I'd like you to join me on this journey. The ideas come from the American Academy of Pediatrics, and they also come from the University of Connecticut, Rudd Center for Food Policy and Obesity. And if you're interested in learning more about that, those are two good sites. Next slide. So that we know that there is a stigma for children and adolescents with weight loss. We know that that's something that they struggle with. We know that there is increased bullying with that. And so what we're seeing is, how can we help patients? And so this was a study, this was a policy statement that came out from the American Academy of Pediatrics. It came out in December of 2017. And they identified that 71% of overweight and obese children were bullied in the last year. And what we're seeing is a stigma around weight can add to health problems, especially in regard to anxiety, depression, and sadness, and can affect quality of life. We find that words are powerful. And so when we're looking at the stigmas associated with obesity and with children, that leads us back to where we are in clinic, and what can we do to combat this, and what can we do to present a positive image? Next slide. This is an infographic that was created by the American Academy of Pediatrics, and it's talking about health consequences of weight stigma, and it's also looking at things that we can do, whether we're looking, as all of us as healthcare providers, whether we're talking to schools, whether we're looking at youth-targeted media, whether we're looking at provider training, and that's how we train physicians, how we train nurses, and how we train other people who work in healthcare settings. And it's looking at what can we say to parents. So this is a national movement. This is an area that can help us with the patient population we're talking about today. Next slide. So what can we do? We can acknowledge our own weight-based bias. It's an interesting topic, and I suggest to you, challenge to you to look at the Harvard Implicit Association test, and you can go in there and they have a quick test that you can take to look at your own weight-based bias. Look at articles from the Rudd Center, that's at the University of Connecticut. Also read articles and look at webinars with the Obesity Action Coalition, and have a conversation with your staff and clinic. What are we doing? Are we leading by example? Next slide. So we want to create a safe environment for patients who are struggling with weight issues. We want to make sure we have armless chairs and love seats in our waiting rooms and exam rooms. We want to make sure we're using medical equipment that can accurately access patients with high body weight. We want to have extra large gowns available if a patient needs to change into a gown. Next slide. We want to use our language carefully. Words matter. And if you look at the choices here, do we say someone's an obese patient, or do we say that someone is a patient with obesity? Do we describe something as morbid obesity, which actually is a little bit of an out of a term that's no longer in favor, and we would more accurately describe somebody as a teen with class 3 childhood obesity, and that would be based on their BMI. Are we describing somebody as non-compliant in our documentation, or are we listing their barriers for success and also listing the strength that they currently have? We find that a lot of our patients in clinic they prefer the verbiage of unhealthy weight or high BMI to obesity. Next slide. We also want to use images wisely. So if we're using images to describe what we're doing in clinic, or we're using images to describe what we're doing in brochures, or we're using images that are positive, are we using images that are showing people active and making positive changes? And I think that's important. Next slide. So we also spend time in our headquarters before and during our clinics, our liver clinics, talking about how can we be positive in what we're saying to young people, and how can we be positive in what we're saying to their parents and caregivers. We think it's important to weigh patients in a private area that allows for confidentiality. I think there are lots of us as adults who don't want to be weighed in the hall and have our weight announced out loud. So we want to be sensitive to that. We give patients who want to be weighed an option for blind weighing, so that way they can turn away and be on the scale and not see the weight. We've occasionally, our ADS, or after visit summary, and our electronic medical record lists the weight. And so we've had patients who've requested not to have it, and we can mark that out. We record weight without comments, and we give patients the option on whether or not they'd like to be informed on how much they weigh. One of the questions that the dietitian that I work with and I might ask is, today, would you like to talk about weight, or today, would you like to talk about diet? And I think that helps to give patients some control over all of that, because we want to open up those conversations. And of course, struggling with weight management is part of it. But I think there are days that our teenagers especially want to talk about what they've done positive in their diet. Maybe they don't want to list the weight. Next slide, please. We want to focus our conversation on how to make behavioral changes instead of emphasizing weight loss. We want to stress the benefits of maintaining healthy habits, whether or not the patient loses weight, because we need to keep going even if things aren't going well. And that's been our experience during the pandemic. And we also want to look for referrals to people like myself, registered dietitians, physical therapists, exercise physiologists, and support groups. And especially if there's support groups that are available locally. During the pandemic, we have found sources, like I said, with our Bull City Fit, where we can encourage people to use YouTube and to use other things that will help them on their struggle to get to a healthy weight. Thank you very much, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thanks so much, Leslie. That was a great talk. I don't see any questions in the chat box yet, but doesn't mean they're not going to come. That was a wonderful talk with very practical tips. I think registered dietitians play such an important role in taking care of patients with NAFLD. Now, changing gears a little bit, we're going to talk about the role of the caregiver next. We're going to hear from Betsy Velati. She's the vice president and a board member of NASH Knowledge. And she also happens to be Tony Velati, who we'll hear from very soon. She happens to be his wife. She's a retired school teacher who still occasionally substitute teaches. And when she married Tony in 1978, she never imagined that her in sickness and in health marriage vows would lead her into her role as a caregiver. Tony refers to her as his angel on earth. Betsy enjoys theater, the company of friends, and most importantly, her grandchildren. So we're excited to hear from her on the role of the caregiver.
Thank you, Maya. Next slide, please. As a caregiver, you're going to wear many hats, and some of them are lifestyle monitor, medical liaison, watchdog, for lack of a better term, family manager, and gatekeeper. Next slide. As the liver disease progresses, your role of caregiver will also become more intense and progress also. Next slide, please. As a lifestyle monitor, it's strongly suggested that you talk to a dietitian and one who is really versed in the liver. You just don't want to talk to a nutritionist who's trying to help people lose weight. You want to talk to a dietitian who really knows what somebody with liver disease needs. Once you know the foods that you should be eating, then you and your loved one, your patient, can start preparing and making healthy meals, hopefully together. And it's also important when you have liver disease that you exercise. When you exercise together, you'll probably exercise more often and not give up as much. So exercising together is important. Next slide. As a medical liaison, and this is as your disease continues to get worse, and you will probably need to accompany your loved one, your patient, to the doctor. And it's strongly suggested that you have your notes written down or put them in your phone. So when you go in there, you haven't forgotten, oh, I wanted to ask this, I wanted to ask that. And then once you ask your questions, there's so much that goes on in the doctor's office that it's important that you take notes, because I can tell you, the minute you walk out of that doctor's office, half of what they said, both you and the person you were with, forget. And you're also going to be arranging for medication, when to take it, what to take, how many times a day to take, how many pills to take. You're going to have to deal with insurances and the pharmacies. And as the disease really progresses to end stage cirrhosis, there's some medications you might have to be a little stronger on administering because it does not taste that well, and your patient may give you pushback on that. Next slide. And the watchdog. I want to talk a little bit about this because this disease comes in and out sometimes. So you really have to be on your toes and watch what's going on with the patient. They can become very confused and forgetful. I can remember sometimes Tony and I would be out to dinner and he couldn't remember how to describe the entree that he wanted that night. We attribute it to old age because we had never heard of hepatic encephalopathy or HE. And so as his disease got worse, and usually his HE got worse when we were on vacation, but at the time I was blaming it on dehydration because, like I said, I never heard of hepatic encephalopathy. But one time we were leaving from vacation and we were going to fill up the car with gas. He was driving on the road so erratically. I didn't know what was going on. And just to say, like, a little discussion went on in that car, like, drive carefully, I am. And finally we got to the gas station and I'm inside getting snacks to take on the way home and thinking, how am I going to wrestle these keys from him? Because there was no way I was going to let him drive again. When I got out to the gas pump, he said, there's something wrong. It won't take my card. And I looked at him and I grabbed the credit card. I filled the car up with gas and he just looked at me and handed over the keys. And another interesting fact you'll find, sometimes hepatic encephalopathy, they will have difficulty with math. Now, Tony, who dealt with finances his entire life, when he was at very bad stage and in the hospital with hepatic encephalopathy, he couldn't even tell me what 7 times 3 was. So be careful with the math. And you'll also notice sometimes there'll be a lot more sleeping, and it's like a baby. They confuse their night and day. They sleep a lot during the day, but they're up at night. So when you see these things, you know that their disease is starting to get worse. And when you do have cirrhosis, your muscles start to wane a little. So you want to watch out for tripping and falling, or if something's that you think isn't that heavy, they think is really heavy, you know, things are not going, that their disease is getting worse. And again, they'll bruise easily, they might be itching, and you'll see more nosebleeds. Next slide, please. So now you become the family manager. And with all that's going on, with the confusion and the forgetfulness, most doctors are going to tell them they're not to be driving anymore. So now all of a sudden you become the chauffeur, and you become the child, taking care of the children. And I often wonder, how does anyone with younger children, or Tony was retired, I was retired, I don't know how people with children can manage all of this. And you end up doing all the cleaning, the cooking, the taking out the trash, just anything that goes along with getting the household to run smoothly, you're going to be doing. And the medical, you're going to be making medical decisions because you can't necessarily trust their judgment at this point. So a lot of medical decisions are going to be done by you. Financial decisions, obviously, if they can't tell you what 7 times 3 is, you better be doing the financial decisions as well. Next slide, please. And gatekeeper, as they get on the transplant list, you want to keep them away from large crowds. You want to keep them away from sick people, because if he would get sick and he got the call, they wouldn't transplant him. And you have to be careful with his emotions. He might not want to be around people because his emotions are so up and so down all the time. Next slide, please. And you can see as the from the X's there, as the fatty liver fibrosis, you can see how much more you need to take care of the patient. Next slide. And with all of this going on, you're going to feel like maybe you could be an octopus with 8 arms. Look at those eyes, they look frightened, but look at the smile on their face, like nothing's wrong. Next slide, please. So you might have signs of burnout. Burnout could be easily irritated, getting upset with somebody in the grocery store, snapping at people, feeling sad, feeling hopeless, crying into your pillow, anger towards other patient, anger towards the patient or towards your loved one. And so instead of crying into your pillow, you might be punching your pillow. You might want to withdraw from friends because they're all happy and excited and you're feeling depressed. And some people find that they want to increase their use of alcohol, prescription drugs, or illicit drugs. Next slide, please. So it's important that you take care of yourself. Next slide. So whatever you do, don't miss your doctor's appointments, because if something happens to you, then there's nothing that you can do to help someone else. So you need to be in top shape to take care of your loved one. If somebody offers help, take it. Or if you need to, ask for help. If your child has to go to a practice, ask somebody in the neighborhood, hey, can you drive them down to the field? I just can't do it. Try to be as social as you can. Get out and see your friends when possible. And it's most important that you take a break every day, whether you take 20 minutes, 30 minutes, you read a book, you meditate, yoga, exercise, do something just for you. Try to keep up with your hobbies. If you like golf, then call somebody to come over and spend time with your loved one while you're out golfing. And if you can, join a support group, which we at NASH Knowledge we do have a support group. Next slide, please. And if you want to join our support group, there's the information. You can contact me. I want to thank you for listening. And I also want to remind all the caregivers out there, you are superheroes in comfortable clothes. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you, Betsy. I definitely appreciate that point of view from the caregiver of a patient with advanced NAFLD. It's a perspective I don't often get as a physician. So next we're going to hear from Wayne Eskridge. We're going to hear, he's going to be speaking about non-invasive testing. This is definitely a hot topic. It was a very hot topic at a recent International Liver Conference that just ended a couple of days ago. Wayne Eskridge is the CEO of the Fatty Liver Foundation, which has as its mission to identify asymptomatic, undiagnosed Americans with liver fibrosis or early cirrhosis caused by fatty liver disease, and to educate them on lifestyle changes that are needed to halt or minimize disease progression. So we look forward to hearing from him about non-invasive testing.
Well, hello, everybody. Tony and I became friends not too long after his transplant, because I had gotten into this nonprofit advocacy business about the same time. So when he invited me to join this panel, I was flattered, and then he asked me to talk about non-invasive testing, and boy, that's cool. That's near and dear to me because I was an engineer, so I really dig on this cutting edge stuff. And we just had the big annual conference of the AASLD, and I have to say, I mean, it's amazing what's coming to us as patients. But as I thought about it, you know, one of the real challenges for people with the disease or wondering about it or dealing with it is what they can use and what they can access to help them. And there are, in the things that they can apply in their journey, or things that they can look for in their communities. And so I thought perhaps I would, instead of indulging myself in the fanciest gee whiz stuff, that I would talk about some of the things that are practical today, the things that I have used, things that I wish that I had as I went through my journey. So I thought I would take that approach. So next slide. These are my disclosures. Next slide. Just a sense of my journey. Most of us don't really get a look at our information, but that's a picture of my liver back when I had gallbladder surgery, and that's a pretty darn ugly thing. And if you ever want to think about having a shock, have your doctor show you a picture like that right out of surgery. But that was in 2010, and I went through a lot of diagnosis stuff, and I didn't get access to testing that I wish I had. And as I look back, there are so many opportunities for me to have learned things that would have helped me, that when you look at that biopsy there in 2015, at that point I was really cirrhotic. I mean, that's my personal slide. And I wasn't in liver hell. I didn't go through what Tony did, but I could see it from where I was. And so I'm one of the patients who have so far managed my disease well. And I've done that in part because I had the opportunity to measure some things along the way. So on the right, that is actually the course that my liver stiffness has taken from the time of my diagnosis up until today. And I've been able to confirm it with FibroScan and MRE along the way. So we'll talk about those a little bit, but what that is a change from a dangerous NASH cirrhosis to of a level 4 disease to a borderline 3, 2, 3, that if I am careful, it should not be the thing that leads to my death. So I feel really good about that. And so I want to share some of those things with you. Next, please. Next slide. So anybody that's ever written anything, you know that as an editor, your mind goes crazy and you don't see your own mistakes. That shouldn't say disclosures. That should say FIB4. So one of the interesting calculators that has been around for a long time and has come into favor in a portion of the medical community is very simple, and it can come, anybody can do this. I mean, you all have the data that you can do this calculation yourselves, and there's calculators online for it, but it takes your age, your AST, ALT, and platelet count, and it derives a probability that you have advanced fibrosis. Next slide. And what they did in Sweden was that they studied about 40,000 people over 16 years, and they measured their FIB4s. And what they have been able to show is that the risk of severe liver disease can be, that a probability can be derived from that calculation that I just showed you. Next slide. And just as an example, this is mine. This shows you the course that I went through from the time that first ugly picture was taken. And at that time, there was not cirrhosis. And I was in the middle of this band between the low cutoff and the high cutoff. And what those signify is if you're below that value, the probability that you have serious cirrhosis or serious fibrosis is low. And if you're above that, you have a high probability. And you can see that I fit the mold exactly. The year that I crossed the high threshold, I got diagnosed with cirrhosis. And that's pretty interesting in itself, but let's go to the next slide. I look back, and in 1990, my FIB4 was 1.23. And if you just imagine that graph going way back to 1990, and I was below that cutoff, and I did not at that time have liver disease. And somewhere in between 1990 and 2010, when I learned that I had a sick liver, I crossed that lower threshold. And had I been monitoring my FIB4 over time, I would have been alerted to the fact that, well, maybe I should pay attention to this. And so, we recommend that people, just as part of what they track over the decades of their life, is this FIB4, because it's the trend that is instructive for you. And it's not diagnostic, but it gives you a direction, and it gives you some red flags, and you can start to ask your doctor, so what does this mean now? Help me understand what this is. So that's really important. So as I think back about the conference that we just had, one of the things that is a takeoff of this, which is this is a blood-based test, is that there's a whole lot of people right now that are doing research for blood-based analysis. And what they do is they take aspects of liver chemistry and they try to come up with formulas like FIB4 that they can apply to people and determine or make a decision, or to give people an answer as to where they stand. So next slide, please. And just as one example, this is one that's done by Stanford that they're just releasing, and it's a medical calculator, and they call it the SAFE. And what it uses is the age, BMI, whether you have diabetes or not, what your AST, ALT levels are, what GGT is, and what your platelets are. And it calculates what they call a SAFE score. And you can see, these are my numbers. You can see that, I have a high risk, and, I know that to be true. All of those things are real, but that is a calculator that they're developing as to serve a function similar to FIB4, but maybe be more accurate. And Mayo is doing one, and there's a whole host of people who are trying to develop this kind of test. So you're going to see those come into the market over the next few years. And I really can enjoy talking about those, but they're not accessible to most people. So we'll leave that for another time. Next slide, please. Something that is worth, in a similar way, something that people have easy access to generally, because we all get a few ultrasounds, and spleen size is pretty sensitive to liver stiffness, because as the liver gets stiffer, the spleen starts getting blood shunted to it. So, again, these are my numbers, and you can see that back in 1998, my spleen size was a normal 11-ish, and when I got sick, it shot up, and at my maximum spleen size, it was a 17, and that's not good. And as I improved my health, my spleen size went back down, and now I'm in a plateauing phase. But because I'm getting older, I'm probably developing, just because of age, I'm coming up a little bit. So those are the kind of things people can look at in their medical records and think about from their own perspective. So a lot of us have heard about FibroScan. So next slide. A lot of us have had FibroScan. This is my current FibroScan, but frequently doctors don't explain these things to patients. And what this one means, you see this cap all the time. And this is a non-invasive test, but the cap is a measure of fat in the liver. And I have a virtually fat-free liver. I've accomplished that. If I had a biopsy today, you couldn't find any fat in my liver. And that 9.6 is what I showed you on the slide, which is the stiffness. And when you see the pictures there, that channel that they're measuring is the speed of the shear wave as it goes through the liver, and that's how the FibroScan works. And if you ever have one of those, try to get them to give you a printout of it, because they do have it available. Next slide. So one of the new machines that is recently coming to market is does a similar job. It's called VeloCure. It's by Sonic Insights. And it does a similar kind of process, but it does it, with a different kind of probe, but it gives similar information. It just doesn't produce the same kind of pretty pictures, but you'll see that come into the market because it's generally a less expensive tool, and it's part of the advancing technology we have in all of these testing devices. So next slide. So the blood-based markers, you have probably heard of FibroSure or FibroTest. Those have been around a while. And what they do is that the people that developed it did a regression analysis, and basically artificial intelligence, and they come up with these scales that are measuring fibrosis and inflammation activity. And that's been around a while. And the difficulty with them is these are all proprietary and expensive, and a lot of insurances don't cover them. But these kind of give you the future, if you will, the kinds of things that we're going to have available to us. And as we get insurance to pay for these kinds of tools, we're going to be able to have more information about the status of our liver and our general health overall. This is, liver is just part of the tremendous research that's being done these days. But next slide. One of the next steps, which is a similar thing, but it adds the next dimension to it, is a test called Liver Fast by Fibrognostics. And so where FibroSure gave you a measure of fibrosis and inflammation, the Liver Fast test has given you a measure of fat content. And again, these are my tests. These are my values. And I do this, I try these things because, I want to validate it against my personal experience, because, I know a lot about my personal experience. And if you look on the right side there, you can see these are the blood values that have been used for this particular analysis. And this is the kind of thing that is coming to us, and you'll start to see those to be more available. There are other kinds of tests that have come out recently that are combination markers that are being used primarily in research, but they will find their way into the market. There's one recently done by Siemens. It's called the ELF test, which I like a part of it really well, because it uses what's called the ProC3, which is a blood marker that measures the amount of collagen that's being active. And that's really important to how the progression of scarring is going on in your liver. So it's a good thing that all of this is happening. So next slide. Other tools that we have available today that you don't get to see usually what the results look like. But there's Liver Multiscan, which is an MRI tool, which gives measurements of liver fat and iron and stiffness. And similar to that is magnetic resonance imaging. And I've done the MRI, which is pretty interesting because they put a big paddle on your side and it whacks at you and they measure it. And that picture in the bottom center there is actually a picture of the waveforms as it goes through your liver, and that measure your stiffness with that kind of thing. So these are tools that we have today that are non-invasive, but just not everywhere available. So next slide. Another one, which is a similar MRI test, which is measuring, you'll hear it frequently. It's more common than the other two, is PDFF, which is an MRI measure of fat content, but it gives you similar kinds of looks, which, you know, the docs will see, but they probably won't show you. So next slide. So the future is really bright in terms of non-invasive tests that are going to be available to us. It's just that I'm impatient to have them come our way, but I hope this has been a helpful glimpse of some of the things that are available. So next slide.
All right, thank you. Moving on to the next talk, we're going to hear from Dr. Alkhouri about NASH drug developments. He's going to give us an update. He is the VP of Academic Affairs, Chief of Transplant Hepatology, and Director of the Fatty Liver Program at Arizona Liver Health. His specialty interests really cross the entire gamut of liver diseases and transplant, but he has a special interest in NAFLD and is an active researcher in the NASH therapeutic space. So I'll hand it over to Dr. Alkhouri.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and thank you for having me tonight. I'm very excited to share with you some new developments of new drugs that should help our patients with fatty liver disease, especially with more advanced disease with NASH and significant fibrosis. Next slide, please. So these are the objectives for my talk. First, I want to tell you what patients with fatty liver disease will actually need to go on medications. And I want to emphasize the point that the majority of patients with fatty liver disease can be managed with lifestyle interventions, and not everyone needs to go on medicines. So the medicines will be reserved for patients with more advanced disease that have a higher chance of progressing to cirrhosis. I want to discuss, when we look at these new drugs, what are the efficacy endpoints? So as doctors, how do we determine if these medications are working? Because we think when they're approved, they will actually require some testing before you can get them covered by insurance. If we can go back one slide. Oh, can we go back? One more. My apologies, I think the slide was timed. And then I'm going to share with you just some new data on drugs in what we call phase 3 development. So that means that they are in the last phase before FDA approval. And if the trial is positive, typically the sponsors, the pharma company will file for FDA approval. I am active on Twitter, so follow me. And we also have a TikTok account, and it's actually very entertaining, and it has videos on FibroScan, liver fibrosis, fatty liver, and other liver diseases. So if you like watching TikTok videos, follow us on AZ Liver. This is for Arizona Liver. Next slide. So when we talk about fatty liver disease, we always talk about this spectrum. Not everyone with fatty liver disease will need to go on medicine. So the majority of people with fatty liver will have what we call simple steatosis, or just non-alcoholic fatty liver. You have fat in the liver, but there is no inflammation, no liver cell injury. NASH is, steatohepatitis. This is when you have steatosis plus inflammation plus injury to the liver cells. But we really start talking about medications when you get to what we call fibrotic NASH. This is when you have enough scarring and liver fibrosis. We have 4 stages of scarring. A normal liver should have 0 fibrosis, and then a cirrhotic liver is the last stage, which is stage 4. And the reason why we focus on treating patients with stage 2 and 3 fibrosis, because these are the patients that are likely to progress to cirrhosis, and we have a window to intervene before they have cirrhosis, but also they develop liver outcomes. This means that they have what we call decompensation. They start retaining fluids in the abdomen. We call it ascites. They may bleed from varices. They may end up developing what we call encephalopathy. And some of these patients will unfortunately require liver transplantation. So we're going to focus with the new drugs that should be FDA approved in the next couple of years on patients with NASH and at least stage 2 fibrosis. Next slide. So when we are designing clinical trials now and trying to get drugs to FDA approval, the FDA said to approve a drug, you need to meet one of 2 endpoints. So at the end of the trial, either you need to show us that with this new drug, you can achieve NASH resolution, which means that you cannot have liver cell injury on a repeat biopsy. You cannot have a lot of inflammation. Or you need to show us that you can reverse fibrosis by 1 stage. As I mentioned, fibrosis has 4 stages. So if you can take someone from stage 3 to stage 2, that's an acceptable outcome. What that means is that we have to do 2 biopsies now to get a drug approved. We have to do a biopsy at the beginning of the trial, make sure they have NASH with stage 2 fibrosis or higher. And then we have to repeat the biopsy at the end of the trial. And typically we do that after 1 year to 18 months. So obviously this is not something we want to do on a large scale. We are okay to do it in clinical trials, but we need to find easier ways to find the sick patients and then to monitor their response to treatment. Next slide. So you heard about some of these non-invasive tests, and in clinical trials, sometimes we use this MRI, we call it MRI PDFF, that can show us how much we reduce liver fat after we use a new drug. We use liver enzymes, ALT and AST, and we try to show reduction after using the medication. And then Wayne showed you some of these MRI technologies, MR elastography and liver multiscan, and we want to also show improvement on these tests at the end of the trial. Next slide. So let me tell you about some of the medications that may make it to market in the near future. Next slide. We have medications that target every step of disease development and progression. So we have drugs that can target just the fat going into the liver by inducing weight loss, by improving insulin sensitivity. So these are diabetes medicines, or by blocking certain enzymes that make fat inside the liver. We also have medications that target liver inflammation. We have medications that can protect the liver cells from the damaging effects of fat. And finally, we have what we call anti-fibrosis drugs. So these are medications that break down the scar tissue that we develop in the liver when you have NASH and fatty liver for a long period of time. So this is encouraging because we have so many drugs that are undergoing development. So some of them will make it to FDA approval. Next slide. Next. So I want to tell you about a drug called resmetirom. This is an abbreviation for what we call a resolution of metabolic syndrome. So they put all these 3 words in one name for the drug, resmetirom. So this drug mimics the effects of the thyroid hormones. It induces a reduction in the bad lipids in the blood, like LDL cholesterol. It decreases the amount of liver fat, but it does not have the negative side effects of thyroid hormones, like cardiac toxicity and loss of bone density. So this is a pill that you take daily. Let's go to the next slide. And in this pilot study here, what we call phase 2B, we showed that you can reduce liver fat on the MRI with the high dose resmetirom by 42% from baseline after only 12 weeks of treatment. So this is very encouraging that you can reduce liver fat by almost 50% after 3 months of being on this pill. We also showed that you can induce some NASH resolution on liver biopsy with this medicine. So this medicine, we should have the phase 3 trial results by the end of 2022. And if it's positive, then we may have FDA approval by the summer of 2023. So very encouraging results, and we are following the clinical trial very closely. Next slide. Another exciting medicine is called lanifibranor. This is a metabolic drug. We have drugs today that we can use to decrease triglycerides, what we call the fenofibrate drugs. We have diabetes drugs we call glitazones that can help with diabetes and insulin resistance. So this is a combination drug. So it works on reducing lipids and improving insulin sensitivity, and also it helps with decreasing liver inflammation. Next slide. So in a phase 2B study, where we had patients go on the high dose of this medicine, lanifibranor, 1200 milligrams daily, this is a pill, compared to placebo, we showed that there was higher percentage of patients that resolved NASH. They improved fibrosis, and about 1/3 of the patients had both NASH resolution and fibrosis improvement. So very encouraging results, and this drug is also in phase 3 now. So hopefully by 2024, we potentially could be hearing about this drug getting close to FDA approval. Next slide. Semaglutide is a diabetes medicine. It's been approved on the market by the FDA for diabetes for a few years now. And recently it was approved also for weight loss under the name Wegovy. And this is an injection that you have to do, what we call subcutaneous injection, but you do it once a week. It's a great diabetes drug. It helps with weight loss, and it can help also improve cholesterol levels. And potentially, in patients with fatty liver disease, we know they have increase in cardiac outcomes and having heart attacks. And this drug has shown that in diabetes patients, it decreases the risk of cardiac events. So a great drug overall, and now we are testing this in phase 3 in NASH. Next slide. And in a phase 2B study also, where we did biopsy at baseline, a biopsy after a year and a half, we showed that if you use the high dose semaglutide, you can achieve NASH resolution in close to 60% of patients. So this is a high rate of resolution of NASH, and we are excited to see if we can get this drug to FDA approval, specifically for NASH with and without diabetes. But if you do have type 2 diabetes, and you have also NASH and significant fibrosis, and you're not on semaglutide and you're struggling to get your A1C to a good level, this will be a nice addition to your diabetes regimen after you discuss with your primary care physician or endocrinologist. Next slide. Obeticholic acid is a synthetic bile acid that is being tested also for NASH. Bile acids, we know they play a role in our digestive system to help us absorb fats from our diet. But the more we learn about bile acids, we realize that they have many metabolic effects, and they can also decrease liver inflammation and potentially liver scarring and fibrosis. So again, this is a synthetic bile acid that you take as a pill. Next slide. So we had a phase 3 trial that tested obeticholic acid in 2 doses versus placebo. This was a large trial called the Regenerate study. Next slide. And in this study, they showed that with the high dose, 25 milligrams daily, we achieved a regression of fibrosis by 1 stage or more in 23% of the patients, and this was better than placebo. The placebo response rate was only 12%. So that was encouraging, and they met one of the endpoints required by the FDA. Next slide. But in the context of the trial, we noticed that this drug caused itching, pruritus, in up to 50% of patients, and it actually increased the bad cholesterol levels, LDL, and caused also cholecystitis, so gallbladder issues, and potentially in patients with cirrhosis and evidence of what we call portal hypertension, increased blood pressure inside the liver, it can cause issues with liver damage. So based on the totality of the data, the FDA decided to hold off on approving this drug. But this is something that is still being considered, so we will see what the future will hold for obeticholic acid. Next slide. Now, I showed you efficacy data for several new medications, and again, the hope that some of them will make it to FDA approval in the next 2 to 4 years or so. But the efficacy is not 100%, and fatty liver is a very heterogeneous group of diseases, if you can say that. So not everyone has the same mechanisms that lead to the disease getting worse. So that's why we think that maybe combining some of these drugs will help our patients to achieve higher rates of response. So I conducted a proof of concept study with Gilead and Novo Nordisk, 2 pharmaceutical companies, where we actually looked at the combination of potentially 3 drugs. One is semaglutide, the diabetes medicine that I mentioned. The other one is called firsocostat. This inhibits lipid accumulation inside the liver cells. And the last one is cilofexor. This is similar to obeticholic acid. It works on bile acid metabolism. So we looked at combining all 3 medications compared to just semaglutide alone. Next slide. And in this proof of concept study, what we showed is that compared to semaglutide alone, you can actually reduce liver fat more if you do combination therapy with 3 drugs. In fact, we showed that, if you want to reduce liver fat by 50% or more, that within only 6 months of treatment, we can achieve this in 85% of patients that went on triple combination therapy. Now, of course, this is proof of concept and we're trying to optimize efficacy, but you have to take cost into consideration and the potential for more side effects when you add more and more medications. But again, we have to explore these combinations and see how we can help our sickest patients achieve the highest response rate. Next slide. Finally, I just want to conclude with a couple of slides on bariatric surgery, which is a very effective treatment for NASH. So this was a paper we just published in JAMA, looking at patients that had NASH, so steatohepatitis with liver fibrosis stage 1 to 3. And we had a group of individuals that underwent bariatric surgery, weight loss surgery, about 650 individuals. And we compared them to match 500 controls that did not have the surgery. And instead of looking at improvement on liver biopsy or MRI, we're like, the most relevant outcome for our patients is really having clinical outcomes, like having cardiovascular events or having liver events, like developing cirrhosis or ascites or encephalopathy. So we followed these patients for a very long period of time, about 10 years, looking at cardiac outcomes and liver outcomes. Next slide. And what we showed here clearly that there's separation between the bariatric surgery group and the control group that just had medical therapy. So when you look at major adverse liver outcomes, you can see that the surgery group had way less outcomes, 5 outcomes over a 10-year period versus 40 outcomes in the control group. And then when we looked at also cardiovascular outcomes, we showed reduction in cardiac events with surgery. So bariatric surgery is definitely an effective treatment. I realize it's not the option for every patient, but if you are considering bariatric surgery, and this is driven partly by NASH, just know that it's a very effective treatment. Next slide. So my take-home message for you guys is that, again, not every patient with fatty liver disease will need new medications. The focus is going to be on patients with NASH, steatohepatitis with evidence of fibrosis, because these are the patients that can benefit the most from medicines. We can potentially prevent progression to cirrhosis and its complications. The phase 3 trials that I showed you are all based on encouraging results from phase 2 trials, and we are anticipating completion in the next couple of years, and hopefully that will lead to some FDA approvals. And I think this is going to change a lot of the inertia that we see associated with fatty liver disease, because one argument I hear over and over that why bother finding fatty liver disease if the only treatment is weight loss and exercise and they need to lose weight anyway. But I think once we have new medications that can reverse the disease, then early identification will become very important so we can prevent progression to cirrhosis. So again, I want to thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak to you tonight, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. El-Khoury. We don't have any questions yet. It doesn't mean they're not going to pop up. So it looks like there is some hope in the near future in terms of NASH therapeutics. So that's exciting to hear. So last but not least, we're going to hear from Tony Vellotti. We're going to hear about life after transplant. We heard from Betsy, his wife, earlier. Tony is the president of NASH Knowledge, as well as a member of the board. He's retired and spent most of his career with the Duquesne Light Company and its subsidiaries in various management positions, and also served on its board of directors. He's a retired CPA. So he had a liver transplant in March of 2018, and that was the catalyst for the formation of NASH Knowledge. So I'll open the floor to Tony.
Thank you, Maya. As indicated, I'm here to talk about life after transplant. The hope would be that people don't reach this stage, through the combination of the lifestyle changes and diet, discussions earlier, the non-invasive technologies that my good friend Wayne talked about, and the potential for drugs and procedures that Dr. El-Khoury talked about. But unfortunately, some people will advance to life after transplant. So I would like to talk about this subject. As background, as Maya mentioned, I had a liver transplant in March 2018. So my comments will be a combination of my lived experience plus information I received from the medical community. The next slide, please. And I'm going to discuss this in a few different sections, as indicated here. Next slide, please. Before we get into what life after transplant is like, I just want to, the first step in having a transplant is getting on a transplant list. And I just want to review some of the outcomes that have been reported by UNOS, which is the United Network for Organ Sharing. And what this indicates that of the people who get on the transplant list in 2021, about 2/3 of those progressed to transplant, actually received a transplant. But 1 out of every 6 people who get on a transplant list either die while they're waiting or they become too sick to transplant. One thing to comment on here is the trend looks good. If you look at the data from 1995 forward, it shows that there's a lower percentage of people being transplanted. But the more recent data, 2021 and some of the earlier years, shows that there's fewer people dying on a transplant list and more people that are being transplanted. Next slide, please. And just to talk very briefly, this was mentioned earlier by Dr. Ganesh when she talked about the living donor programs. But after 1 year, survival rate's 86%. After 3 years, it's 78%. After 5 years, it's 72%. You might expect that this would vary by age, but not so much. For example, after 5 years, the survival rate for the people 65 and over is still 66%. So there's not a huge difference by age. Next slide, please. I saw the precursor to receiving this transplant is getting the phone call that there is a liver available, and this was the most stressful part of the whole transplant process. Every night for 3 months, I asked my wife to be sure that her cell phone was charged, because I was sure this was going to be the night that I got that call. Well, the call finally came, and in my case, they told me they had a high risk liver available. So they said, I got the call. They said we might have one available. We have to talk with the surgeon to be sure he's okay with it. So just hang tight, which I did. I got a call back an hour later and said, and I was told to come into the hospital, and I had to transplant the next morning. Next slide, please. After this transplant, the immediate aftermath, first thing is, you'll be in a hospital for a while. The typical stay is 1 to 3 weeks. I was fortunate. I was home 8 days after the transplants. The first 2 or 3 days of that will be spent in the ICU. And they start medications immediately. They're concerned about 2 things. Foremost is they want to be sure there is not rejection of the liver. They're introducing an organ into your body that the rest of the body doesn't know, and the immune system may try to reject it. So they're concerned about that. That's the primary concern. But they're also worried about infection. They'll start with therapy almost immediately. I got back to my hospital room about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and by that evening, the therapist showed up, got me out of bed with their help and a walker, and made me go to take a walk to the restroom. And that continues through your whole stay in the hospital. Very extensive therapy. You see these people often, and in my situation, because I have a multi-level home, they need to make sure that I could do steps before I could leave the hospital. So we did that as well in the hospital. They're concerned about your respiratory situation. I woke up with a breathing tube, which was very distasteful. But they took that out. But I was on oxygen for a little while, and they present you with a set of exercises to do that continue for a while after the transplant to be sure that you're getting sufficient oxygen. Sleeping is difficult during hospital stay. Sleeping in hospital is always hard because all the noises and so forth. But what complicates this this situation is I had 40 staples in my abdomen, and the drugs, the medications were also interfering with my sleep. Also, there was swelling in my legs and feet. In fact, when I left the hospital, I had a lot of difficulty getting my shoes on that I walked to the hospital with. Before you leave the hospital, the transplant coordinator will sit down with you and go through a list of items that you need to know before you go home. I have to tell you, it was a little bit reminiscent as after a first child coming back from the hospital with that. It's like, okay, geez, I'm on my own now. Next slide, please. At home, once you're home, what you have to get used to for at least a few weeks is a very regimented lifestyle. You'll receive monthly phone calls from the transplant coordinator asking how you're doing. You'll have to record all your fluid intakes and outtakes. They want to be sure that you're not retaining fluids. There are 2 times a week you'll do blood work. For the first 5 or 6 weeks, the visiting nurse came and took my blood, and the purpose of that was that the blood work will indicate early signs of rejection, and that's a primary concern. The caretaker is really critical. Betsy talked a little bit about that earlier, but with the staples and so forth, you really can't. And you're very weak when you first get in from the hospital. You really need the caretaker to help you get out of bed and just do, in the early days, just the normal things. And when in our situation, we slept in separate bedrooms because of my staples and not one to disturb me. And so I would call her. I had to call Betsy when I needed to go to the bathroom, for example. So there's so that it becomes a normal routine. The medication compliance is very important. The anti-rejection drugs have to be taken on a very precise schedule. You take them 12 hours apart, but you're taking 16. I was taking 16 pills every day, so we had to set alarms because you couldn't. Certain pills couldn't be taken in conjunction with others, and so it seemed like there were alarms going off all the time at our house. After a week, you visit the clinic and they just check your your healing and so forth. The first visit they removed my staples, which was a big step forward. Then the next visit was 2 weeks later. Then it was a month, and and then it got to the point where it was 6 months. And the blood work eventually, rather than 2 times a week, became weekly, then monthly, and so forth. But that was a retain. But there's a few things to be aware of as well. One thing was weight loss. In the first 2 weeks I was home, I lost 10% of my body weight, and that stayed off for the first 6 weeks. I didn't have much of an appetite, which if anyone who knows me, that realize that's a big change for me. After about 6 to 8 weeks, I was able to drive, and that I was getting my strength. I was able to drive. I was retired, so I didn't have to worry about going to work. But in a normal situation, you get to you be able to return to work in 2 or 3 months. So that after the first couple months, we get to the point, to a situation where I call the new normal. Next slide, please. In this new normal, it's kind of a proceed with caution. On one hand, there are no restrictions in terms of what you eat. When I first came in from the hospital, I was told no buffets, no sushi, don't drink it, and if you go out to eat, don't drink any fountain drinks. But after the first couple of months, there are no restrictions at all. But you still have to proceed with caution for a couple of reasons. One, the threat of rejection is always overlaying your situation, and so that you need to continue even to stay. I'm almost 4 years after transplant, and I'm still doing blood work monthly to check on the possibility of rejection, and they'll continue to fiddle with your medications. I mean, as recently as a couple months ago, they changed my dosage, and so it's a kind of an ongoing situation. The other thing that you'll find is that there is weight gain once you're back to this new normal. I just saw a study the other day that said within 3 years, the typical patient will gain about 20 pounds after transplant. The important thing is just you can't fall back into your old habits. There's a non-alcoholic fatty liver disease can reoccur. In fact, there's a recent study that showed that after 5 years, about 25% of the patients have non-alcoholic fatty liver again, and after 10 years, about 1/3 do. So it's something. While life is kind of back to normal, it's not quite. You really have to watch. The last thing that I'll mention regarding the new normal is that these medications have side effects. The transplant is not a get out of jail free card. In my situation, I was a diabetic who had never taken insulin, but I take insulin now. I never had any kidney issues, but the medications affected my kidneys to the point where I've lost half my kidney function. So it's really important to continue to monitor the disease and really need to be cautious of what's going on. Next slide, please. The last thing that I want to talk about, and one of the underlying themes that is present from the minute after your transplant to the end, is the threat of liver rejection. About 1 of every five patients will experience liver rejection. That doesn't mean that you need a new liver. It just means that they may need to adjust your medication, and this is why the blood work is so important. It's really an early warning signal to let you know if rejection seems to be on the horizon. There are some signs of rejection: fever or flu-like symptoms, abdominal pain. But the blood work is your the best indicator of whether you will have issues with rejection. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Tony, for that insight. It's valuable insight from someone who's had the disease and really experienced the whole trajectory. There was a question in the chat box about regarding whether there are drugs to reverse cirrhosis. The bottom line is there are, Dr. Alkhouri, I don't know if you want to take that question.
Yeah, I'm happy to take the question, and the answer is yes, absolutely. There is a lot of excitement about finding drugs that can finally reverse cirrhosis and take patients from stage 4 fibrosis to stage 3 or even lower. I think, they're not going to be FDA approved anytime soon, but we have promising data, for example, with the drug called efruxifermin, where they had, patients on the drug for a short period of time, and they showed that about 33% had regression from F4 to F3. We're also looking at combination therapy for cirrhosis. There's another drug called belapectin that's looking also at preventing progression to varices. These are the vessels that can bleed into the esophagus and stomach. So yes, definitely we are looking at this. However, the FDA said that to get a drug approved for the cirrhosis indication, you have to show improvement in outcomes. They're not satisfied just with the improvement on a biopsy or biomarkers. And that's why I said it's going to be a few years before we have something that's FDA approved for cirrhosis. But the key is that we want to prevent patients from progressing to cirrhosis. And hopefully we can identify these patients and intervene early on.
Thank you. So I just wanted to thank all of the speakers and the audience for attending. I really enjoyed this evening hearing perspectives about NAFLD from patients themselves who've experienced the disease to really every component of NAFLD care. Now I'll hand it over to Karen and to Susanna to see if they have anything to say in conclusion.
Thank you, Maya. I would just like to reiterate thank you to everyone that spoke this evening. All of the talks were fascinating, and I'd like to thank everyone in attendance. We hope to continue this as a yearly event and bring you now people literally from all over the country now. Our coalition is expanding with Zoom, and we're really quite excited about that. Susanna?
Thank you, Dr. Zapeka, and thank you, Dr. Balakrishnan. We appreciate your leadership for this program and for our coalition. And we thank our coalition members for coming together to help plan this important update. This is our 3rd annual, and we will continue to do this. And I just wanted to let you know, we had people from 4 different countries in addition to across our country tonight's program. So, we are really excited to bring lots of patients together and their caregivers. I want to thank NASH Knowledge and our sponsors, and I especially want to thank our staff, Amy and Dee, for their work behind the scenes to make everything run smoothly, and our technology team at Encore. And I want to remind you to be sure to take the evaluation. Tell us what you thought, what you think we did well, but more importantly, what we can do better or different, and what you want to hear and hope to learn more, because we're definitely interested in serving our patient population in the ways that they need us to. And we also will have the patient survey. So we have an evaluation, but we also have a patient survey. We're interested in knowing more about our patient population because that helps us to better develop our education and support services to you. So on behalf of the Community Liver Alliance, our board of directors, our staff, and our volunteers, we thank you all so much for being a part of this, and we wish you a very good evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Susanna.